They say blood is thicker than water, but at my sister Victoria's wedding, I learned that money is thicker than both. Picture this. I'm sitting at the back table of my own sister's reception, treated like a stranger at my own family's celebration. My parents, Richard and Margaret Carter, publicly humiliated me and my husband Dan in front of 200 guests. The words still echo in my mind. "You're nothing without us," after the vows get out. The entire ballroom fell silent. Champagne glasses froze mid-air. My sister smirked as if she'd been waiting for this moment her whole life. I felt my husband's hand tighten around mine as shame burned through my chest like acid. But here's what they didn't know, what nobody knew. 3 days later, the lawyer called. Grandpa Joe's will was being read. The same family that had just cast me out was about to discover that the quiet old man they'd taken for granted had been worth $7 billion. And every single penny, every stock option, every property deed, every trust fund had my name on it. Their name nowhere to be found. What happened next will shock you. The same parents who spat venom at me were suddenly on their knees begging. The sister who laughed at my humiliation. Let's just say karma has a sense of humor. If you think you know how this story ends, think again. Because what my family did to get that inheritance back will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about love, loyalty, and revenge. This is my story of the $7 billion betrayal, and trust me, you haven't heard anything yet. My name is Liz Carter Wilson. I'm 35 years old, and until 3 hours ago, I thought I had my life perfectly mapped out. As a senior marketing director at Brennan & Associates in Chicago, I'd spent the last decade building a career that would make anyone proud. But sitting here at the passenger seat of our Honda Civic watching the familiar farmland of rural Illinois blur past my window, I'm reminded that some calls can shatter even the most carefully constructed plans. The phone rang at exactly 2:47 p.m. while I was in the middle of presenting our Q4 campaign strategy to the board. I almost didn't answer it. Margaret Carter, my mother, and I hadn't spoken in 6 months, not since our last awkward conversation about why Dan and I hadn't visited for Christmas again. But something about the way the phone kept buzzing made my stomach clench with dread. "Liz?" Her voice was thin, stretched with panic. "It's your grandfather. He's had a stroke." The conference room around me seemed to tilt sideways. Grandpa Joe, 83 years old and stubborn as the day is long, had always seemed indestructible to me. Even when I was a child, he was the one constant in our family's complicated dynamics, the steady anchor while everyone else seemed to drift in different directions. "How bad is it?" I managed to ask, stepping out into the hallway as concerned faces watched me through the glass conference room doors. "Bad enough that you need to come home," she said. And those 8 words carried the weight of everything unsaid between us. Dan found me 20 minutes later, sitting in my office with my head in my hands, still in shock. My husband of 7 years took one look at my face and immediately started making calls. That's who Dan Wilson is, a high school history teacher who approaches crisis the same way he approaches lesson planning, methodically, calmly, and with complete focus on what needs to be done. While I was still processing the news, he'd already arranged for substitute teachers to cover his classes, cleared his weekend coaching obligations, and packed our overnight bags. "We'll leave as soon as you're ready," he said simply, and I felt that familiar surge of gratitude for this man who'd chosen to love me, despite all the family complications that came with the package. The drive from Chicago to Millbrook takes 4 hours on a good day. Today, with Dan pushing the speed limit and my anxiety climbing with every mile marker, it felt like both an eternity and not nearly long enough. I spent the first hour making work calls, rearranging meetings, and delegating projects to my team. But as the city skyline faded behind us and the landscape opened into endless stretches of cornfields and small towns, my mind inevitably drifted to the last time I'd made this journey. 10 years ago, I'd driven this same route in the opposite direction, my car packed with everything I owned, tears streaming down my face after the worst fight of my life with my parents. I can still hear my father's voice, cold and disappointed. So, you're just going to abandon everything we've worked for, everything this family stands for, and my mother's quiet addition that somehow hurt even more. I thought we raised you to understand responsibility, Elizabeth. They hadn't understood then, and I doubted they understood now why I'd needed to leave Millbrook. Growing up in a town of 200 people where everyone knew your family's history going back 4 generations, I'd always felt like I was suffocating. The Carter name carried weight there. My great-great-grandfather had founded the town's first general store, and every generation since had been expected to contribute to the family legacy. But I'd wanted more than managing inventory and serving the same customers my grandmother had served. I'd wanted to discover who I could become beyond the narrow confines of what everyone expected. Grandpa Joe had been the only one who'd seemed to understand. The night before I left, he'd slipped me an envelope with enough money to cover my first month's rent in Chicago, and a note that simply said, "Sometimes the best way to honor where you come from is to learn where you can go. Come back when you're ready, not when they tell you to be." I'd carried that note in my wallet for 10 years, pulling it out whenever I doubted my choices. And now, as we took the exit for Millbrook General Hospital, I wondered if ready was something I'd ever truly be. Dan reached over and squeezed my hand as we navigated the familiar streets of my childhood. Everything looked smaller than I remembered, but also somehow more worn down. The downtown storefronts that had bustled with activity when I was growing up now showed more for-lease signs than open businesses. Even Carter's General Store, the family business that had anchored Main Street for over a century, looked tired and faded. "You okay?" Dan asked softly as we pulled into the hospital parking lot. Before I could answer, I saw her. Victoria Carter, my younger sister by 3 years, was pacing near the main entrance with her phone pressed to her ear. Even from a distance, I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she gestured sharply with her free hand. She'd always been the dramatic one in our family, but there was something different about her posture now, something that spoke of genuine fear rather than her usual theatrical flair. As we pulled into a parking space, Victoria looked up and spotted our car. For a moment, our eyes met through the windshield, and I felt my breath catch. The look on her face told me everything had changed since I'd been gone. Victoria ended her phone call abruptly. As Dan and I approached the hospital entrance, her face a mask of barely controlled emotion that I recognized from our childhood arguments. She'd always worn her feelings like armor, using intensity to shield herself from vulnerability, and today was no exception. "You came," she said, her voice flat and carefully neutral. There was no embrace, no relief in her tone, just a statement of fact that somehow managed to sound like an accusation. Her dark hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and I could see she'd been crying despite her attempt to appear composed. "Of course I came," I replied, unsure whether to attempt a hug or maintain the distance she seemed to prefer. "How is he?" "Stable for now," Victoria said, turning to walk into the hospital without waiting for us to follow. "Mom and Dad are upstairs. They've been here since this morning." The elevator ride to the cardiac unit felt like it lasted hours, filled with the kind of silence that builds walls instead of bridges. Dan stood slightly behind me, a steady presence I was grateful for, as we approached the confrontation I'd been dreading for 10 years. When the doors opened on the 4th floor, I could see my parents sitting in the waiting area, their familiar silhouettes somehow both exactly as I remembered, and startlingly older. Margaret Carter looked up as we approached, and I watched her face cycle through surprise relief and something that might have been disappointment all in the span of a few seconds. She stood and smoothed her blouse, a nervous habit I remembered from childhood, before offering me the kind of polite smile she'd give a neighbor she hadn't seen in a while. "Elizabeth," she said, using my full name the way she always did when she was trying to maintain emotional distance. "Thank you for coming so quickly." My father, Richard Carter, remained seated, his weathered hands folded in his lap as he studied me with the same analytical expression he'd used to evaluate livestock at the county fair. He nodded once in acknowledgement but said nothing, and I felt that familiar weight of his unspoken judgment settling on my shoulders. "We should be able to see him soon." Margaret continued, filling the awkward silence with practical information. "The doctor said visiting hours are flexible given the circumstances, but they don't want too many people in the room at once." Dan stepped forward and extended his hand to my father, who shook it with the kind of firm grip that conveyed both politeness and evaluation. "Mr. Carter, I'm sorry we're meeting again under these circumstances. How are you holding up?" It was exactly the right thing to say, and I felt a surge of appreciation for my husband's ability to navigate family tensions with grace. Richard's expression softened slightly as he stood to shake Dan's hand properly. "Been better days," my father admitted, his voice carrying the exhaustion of a man who'd been carrying too much weight for too long. "But Joe's tougher than the rest of us probably." When we were finally allowed into Grandpa Joe's room, the sight of him connected to monitors and IV lines hit me harder than I'd expected. Joseph Carter had always seemed larger than life to me, with his broad shoulders and hands that could fix anything, but lying in that hospital bed he looked every one of his 78 years. His eyes were closed, and for a terrifying moment, I thought we were too late. Then he sensed our presence and opened his eyes, scanning the room until they found mine. The smile that spread across his face was weak but genuine, transforming his pale features with a joy that made the other family members shift uncomfortably. "Lizzie girl," he whispered, his voice raspy but clear. "You came home." I moved to his bedside, fighting back tears as I took his hand in mine. His grip was weaker than I remembered, but his eyes were as sharp as ever, studying my face with the same intensity he'd used to read the weather patterns that determined harvest success. Dr. Patterson, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and graying hair, entered the room as we were settling around the bed. She introduced herself and began explaining Grandpa Joe's condition with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd delivered similar news too many times. "The stroke was significant," she said, glancing around at our assembled family. "He's stable now, but recovery will be a long process, months, possibly longer. Most importantly, he needs to avoid stress. I understand there are some family business concerns that have been weighing on his mind." Victoria's composure finally cracked at the doctor's words. "Family business concerns," she repeated, her voice rising with barely controlled hysteria. "Try complete financial disaster. Try working 16-hour days, trying to keep everything from falling apart, while everyone else gets to live their perfect lives somewhere else." The words hit the room like a physical blow, and I felt my face flush with shame and anger in equal measure. Margaret immediately moved to Victoria's side, her maternal instincts overriding the awkward family dynamics. "Victoria has been carrying an enormous burden," my mother said, her voice steady but pointed. "She gave up her college plans, her dreams of moving to Minneapolis, everything she wanted to help us when you left for Chicago. She's been holding this family together single-handedly." The accusation hung in the air like smoke, impossible to ignore. Richard remained silent, but I could feel his disappointment radiating across the room like heat from a fire. Dan started to say something, probably to defend me, but I caught his eye and shook my head slightly. This wasn't his fight, and his intervention would only make things worse. "I never asked her to do that," I said quietly, but Victoria whirled on me with years of accumulated resentment blazing in her eyes. "No, you just left," she shot back. "You just walked away from all of us and never looked back. Do you have any idea what it's been like trying to run the store, take care of Mom and Dad, manage Grandpa Joe's medical appointments, all while watching everything our family built slowly crumble?" Before I could respond, I felt Grandpa Joe's hand tighten around mine with surprising strength. When I looked down, his eyes were locked on mine with an intensity that silenced the argument swirling around us. "The store," he whispered, his voice so low I had to lean closer to hear him. "Save our legacy, Lizzie. You're the only one who can." The next morning dawned gray and humid, matching my mood as Dan and I drove through downtown Millbrook toward Carter's General Store. I'd barely slept, Grandpa Joe's whispered words echoing in my mind alongside Victoria's accusations and the weight of 10 years of family silence. As we turned onto Main Street, I felt my stomach drop at the sight of the store that had once been the pride of our family. The building itself looked tired, its red brick facade faded and streaked with water stains from gutters that clearly needed repair. The hand-painted sign that had once proclaimed Carter's General Store, serving Millbrook since 1952, was so weathered that some letters were barely visible. What struck me most, though, was the emptiness. Where I remembered a bustling storefront with customers coming and going throughout the day, now only 2 cars sat in the small parking lot, and one of them belonged to my family. Victoria was unlocking the front door when we arrived, her movements sharp and efficient, despite the obvious exhaustion in her posture. She glanced up as we approached, but didn't offer a greeting, simply holding the door open with the kind of resigned politeness you'd show unwanted but inevitable guests. "I suppose you want the grand tour," she said, her voice carrying none of the warmth I remembered from our childhood when she used to beg to help me stock shelves during summer breaks. Stepping inside Carter's General Store for the first time in a decade was like walking into a beloved photograph that had been left in the sun too long. Everything was recognizable but faded, diminished in ways that went beyond simple aging. The wide wooden floors that Grandpa Joe had always kept polished to a warm honey glow were now scuffed and dull. The shelves that had once overflowed with everything from hardware to home goods were now sparsely stocked with gaps so obvious they looked like missing teeth in a smile. "Business has been slow," Victoria said, following my gaze around the store with defensive resignation. "People don't shop local like they used to." She led us through the aisles, and I noticed how she unconsciously straightened merchandise and adjusted displays as we walked, the automatic gestures of someone who'd been caring for this place alone for too long. The cash register, an ancient but reliable model that had been old when I was a child, was held together with electrical tape. Behind the counter, I could see stacks of invoices weighted down with a coffee mug, and even from a distance, I could spot the red, overdue stamps on several of them. "The freezer unit died last month," Victoria continued, gesturing toward the empty dairy section. "We can't afford to replace it, so we just stopped carrying frozen foods. The hardware section is mostly picked over because we can't restock fast enough. And the Postal Service wants to end our contract because we can't guarantee consistent hours anymore." Dan wandered toward the back of the store where a small cafe area had once served coffee and sandwiches to farmers and townspeople taking breaks from their daily routines. Now the tables were stacked with unopened boxes, and dust motes danced in the sunlight streaming through windows that needed washing. "What about the Megamart?" I asked, though I already knew the answer would be painful to hear. Victoria's laugh was bitter. 20 minutes down Highway 9, everything we sell plus 1,000 things we can't afford to stock, all at prices we can't match. Free parking, air conditioning that works, and checkout lanes that don't take 10 minutes because the register keeps freezing up." She kicked at a loose floorboard that creaked ominously. "Most of our old customers still wave when they drive past on their way there." The sound of the front door chime interrupted our conversation, and I turned to see Richard entering with the weight of the world on his shoulders. He nodded at Dan and me, but addressed Victoria directly. "Henderson called about the mortgage again," he said quietly. "We're officially 3 months behind now. He says the bank's patience is running thin." The words hit the room like a physical blow. I felt Dan tense beside me, and Victoria's face went pale beneath her carefully applied makeup. 3 months. I repeated my marketing background, immediately calculating the implications. "Dad, that means you're looking at foreclosure proceedings." Richard's jaw tightened, and for a moment I saw the proud man who'd taught me to drive struggling with the reality of admitting failure to the daughter who'd left home to pursue bigger dreams. "We've been trying to work something out," he said finally. "Henderson knows, this family knows what this store means to the community. He's been giving us extensions, but his hands are tied by corporate policy." Margaret appeared from the back office carrying a ledger book that looked like it had survived several decades of record-keeping. Her face was drawn and I could see the stress of keeping family secrets written in the lines around her eyes. "We didn't want Joe to know how bad things had gotten," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "His doctor said any additional stress could trigger another stroke, and we thought we could figure something out before—" She trailed off, gesturing helplessly at the declining store around us. That afternoon, Helen Martinez stopped by while Victoria was showing me the cramped office where bills and paperwork had accumulated in overwhelming piles. Helen had worked at Carter's for 15 years before retiring, and seeing her familiar face was like finding an anchor in a storm of family crisis. "Mija," she said, embracing me with the kind of genuine warmth that had been missing from all my other family interactions. "I heard you were back. How's your grandfather?" We talked for a few minutes about Grandpa Joe's condition before Helen's expression grew serious. She glanced around to make sure we weren't overheard, then leaned closer. "Your grandfather built this place as the heart of Millbrook," she said quietly. "It wasn't just a store. It was where people came to catch up on news, where farmers sold their produce, where kids bought penny candy after school. But times have changed, Liz. People want convenience now and one-stop shopping and prices that this family business just can't compete with." That evening, after Dan had gone to bed in our room at the Millbrook Inn, I spread the financial records across the small desk and tried to make sense of the numbers that would determine my family's future. Invoice after invoice told the story of a business slowly bleeding to death, and as I traced the patterns of declining sales and mounting debts, a horrible realization began to form. As I looked through the financial records that night, I realized the family hadn't just been hiding problems from Grandpa Joe, they'd been hiding them from each other. The revelation about my family's financial deceptions weighed heavily on my mind as I returned to the hospital the next afternoon, but Grandpa Joe seemed more alert than he had the day before. His color was better, and when he saw me enter his room alone, he patted the chair beside his bed with more strength than I'd seen since arriving in Millbrook. "I sent your parents home to get some rest," he said, his voice stronger though still raspy. "Figured it was time you and I had a proper conversation, just the two of us." I settled into the uncomfortable hospital chair, studying his face for signs of the frailty I'd witnessed yesterday. Instead, I saw the sharp intelligence that had always made Grandpa Joe my favorite confidant, the man who'd listened to my childhood dreams without judgment and encouraged my questions when everyone else seemed to think curiosity was a nuisance. "Tell me about Chicago," he said first, deflecting my concerns about his health with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to focusing on others rather than himself. "Tell me about the work you're doing, the life you've built." For 20 minutes, I found myself describing my career at Brennan & Associates, the campaigns I'd developed, the clients I'd helped grow their businesses. Grandpa Joe listened with the kind of focused attention that made you feel like your words mattered, asking thoughtful questions that showed he understood the complexities of modern marketing despite never having left rural Illinois. "You've done well for yourself, Lizzie," he said finally. "But I wonder if you know why I was never angry about you leaving like your parents were." I shook my head, remembering the painful arguments and the way my departure had divided the family into camps of support and resentment. "Because I understood something they didn't." Grandpa Joe continued, shifting slightly in his bed to face me more directly. "Sometimes you have to go away to understand what home really means. I learned that myself when I was about your age." He began telling me about his return from Korea in 1952, painting a picture of a young man who'd seen enough of the world to know that Millbrook was where he belonged, but also enough to understand what small communities needed to survive in a changing America. "When I came back from the war, this town was dying," he said, his eyes growing distant with memory. The young men had either been killed overseas or stayed in the cities where they'd trained. The farms were struggling because there was no central place for them to sell their goods or buy supplies without driving to the county seat. The store, he explained, had been his answer to multiple problems at once. It wasn't just a retail establishment, but a carefully planned community anchor designed to serve functions that went far beyond simple commerce. "We weren't just selling goods, Lizzie. We were building community bonds that keep small towns alive," he said with the quiet pride of someone who'd watched his vision succeed for decades. The store hosted town meetings when the city hall was being renovated. We let local farmers set up tables in the back to sell their produce directly to neighbors. When the Hendersons lost their house in that fire back in '67, we collected donations and coordinated the rebuilding effort right from our front counter. I found myself leaning forward, captivated by stories I'd never heard despite growing up in the middle of them. Grandpa Joe painted pictures of harvest celebrations in the store's parking lot of community bulletin boards that connected neighbors with needs to neighbors with solutions of credit, extended during hard times and celebrated during good ones. Your grandmother and we made sure that anyone who needed help could find it here, he continued. Sometimes that meant letting families run tabs when crops failed. Sometimes it meant staying open late when someone needed medicine for a sick child. Sometimes it just meant listening when people needed to talk through their problems. He asked me to bring him the photo albums from the cabinet beside his bed, and for the next hour we paged through decades of images that told the story of Carter's General Store as the living heart of Millbrook. There were pictures of ribbon cuttings for local businesses that had started with display space in our store of community Christmas parties, where 3 generations of families gathered around tables laden with potluck dishes of my own parents, as young adults working alongside Grandpa Joe, with smiles that spoke of purpose and pride. Look at this one, he said, pointing to a faded color photograph from what must have been the late 1970s. It showed the store during what was clearly its golden era, bustling with customers, shelves fully stocked, and a hand-lettered sign advertising, "Local honey, support your neighbors." In the background, I could see my father demonstrating fishing equipment to a group of children while my mother organized what appeared to be a bake sale near the entrance. Those were good years, Grandpa Joe said softly. The whole family working together, the community thriving, everyone supporting each other. But I always knew things would have to change eventually. His voice grew more animated as he began describing dreams I'd never heard him mention before. The current store, he explained, was just the beginning of what he'd always envisioned for Millbrook's future. I've been planning for years to expand the concept, he said, his eyes lighting up with the enthusiasm of someone sharing a cherished secret. Not just a store, but a proper community center, meeting spaces where people can gather for everything from town councils to book clubs. Business incubator space where young entrepreneurs can start their ventures without the overhead of separate rent. Educational programs, cultural events, maybe even a small museum of local history. The scope of his vision took my breath away. This wasn't the modest expansion I might have expected from a small-town store owner, but a comprehensive plan for community revitalization that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of economic development principles. I've been saving money for this project for over a decade, he admitted, lowering his voice as if someone might overhear. Not much at a time, but steadily. I wanted to surprise the family once I had enough to make it happen without risking what we'd already built. He studied my face carefully before continuing. I need someone with business knowledge and fresh ideas, but also someone who understands our values. Someone who can see the potential in what we've always been while having the skills to help us become what we need to be. Then Grandpa Joe pulled out a folder I'd never seen before containing detailed plans that would change everything I thought I knew about his dreams. The folder was thick with documents that had clearly been organized and reorganized many times, each paper showing the careful attention of someone who'd spent years refining every detail. As Grandpa Joe spread the contents across his hospital bed tray, I found myself looking at professional architectural drawings that took my breath away with their scope and ambition. Carter Community Center, read the header on the first blueprint, and beneath it was a detailed floor plan that transformed everything I thought I knew about my grandfather's modest retail operation. The drawings showed a 15,000 square foot space that would encompass not just our current store location, but the adjacent buildings that had sat empty for the past several years. Where I saw urban decay and economic decline, these plans revealed a comprehensive vision for community revitalization that rivaled anything I'd seen in my professional work with major corporations. I've been working with Tom Peterson on these designs for 3 years, Grandpa Joe explained, referring to the architect who'd grown up 2 streets over from our house. and had returned to Millbrook after establishing himself in Springfield. Tom understands what small towns need to survive, and he's donated hundreds of hours to make sure these plans would actually work for our community. The main level showed a reimagined retail space that maintained the general store concept while expanding it into what the plans labeled as local artisan marketplace. Instead of competing with Megamart on price and selection, this design embraced what made small-town commerce unique. Dedicated spaces were allocated for local farmers to display seasonal produce, for craftspeople to sell handmade goods, and for small food vendors to offer items that couldn't be found in corporate chains. "Look at this section here," Grandpa Joe said, pointing to an area marked Business Startup Incubation Space. The architectural drawings showed a series of small retail stalls with shared storage and utilities designed to allow new entrepreneurs to test their business concepts without the overhead costs that typically made startup ventures impossible in rural areas. Young people leave Millbrook because they think there are no opportunities here. But what if we created opportunities that didn't exist anywhere else? The second level of the proposed community center was even more ambitious. The plans showed flexible meeting spaces that could accommodate everything from town council sessions to wedding receptions, a dedicated senior center with activities designed to combat the isolation that plagued many of Millbrook's elderly residents, and youth program areas equipped with computers and study spaces that would give local children resources their families couldn't afford individually. "The town council already approved the concept unanimously," Grandpa Joe continued, producing a folder of official documents that bore the letterhead of the Millbrook City Council. "Mayor Henderson says it's the most exciting development proposal they've seen in 20 years. The existing zoning supports mixed-use development, and the building permits have been pre-approved pending final funding confirmation." As I studied the approval documents, I realized this wasn't the pipe dream of an aging store owner, but a carefully researched project that had already navigated the complex bureaucratic requirements of local government. Grandpa Joe had spent years laying groundwork that I was only now beginning to understand. "The real breakthrough came 18 months ago," he said, producing another set of documents that made my hands shake as I read them. "The State Rural Development Office approved us for matching grant funding through their Community Revitalization Initiative. They'll provide dollar-for-dollar matching up to $500,000 contingent on our ability to demonstrate community support and business viability." $500,000 in matching funds would transform the entire economic landscape of Millbrook, and I felt my marketing mind immediately calculating the multiplier effect such an investment would have on local employment tax revenue and business development. But as I read the fine print of the grant requirements, I also understood why Grandpa Joe's expression had grown increasingly urgent. "The application deadline is 6 months from now," I said, looking up to meet his eyes. "That's exactly when the current store lease expires." "The timing isn't coincidental," he admitted. "I planned it that way because I knew we'd need to demonstrate serious commitment to change, not just maintain the status quo. But I also knew that 6 months would be enough time to prove the concept if we had the right leadership." He pulled out a legal document that bore the signature of James Morrison, Millbrook's only attorney, confirming the financial structure Grandpa Joe had created to support his vision. According to Morrison's analysis, Grandpa Joe had accumulated nearly $300,000 in savings over the past decade, money that had been carefully invested and protected specifically for this community center project. "This isn't just about saving our store, Lizzie," Grandpa Joe said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who understood exactly what failure would mean. "It's about saving Millbrook itself from becoming another ghost town. The young families are already leaving for places with better opportunities. The elderly are moving to assisted living facilities in larger towns because they can't get the services they need here. If we lose this chance, there won't be another one." The legal documents made clear that if the grant application failed, or if the project couldn't demonstrate sufficient community support within the 6-month timeline, not only would the family lose the current store, but Grandpa Joe's entire life savings would be at risk. The matching grant requirements meant that all committed funds had to remain in escrow until the project reached specific milestones, and failure to meet those milestones would result in forfeiture of both the grant money and the matching private investment. I need someone who understands both the business side and the heart of what we're trying to accomplish, Grandpa Joe said, organizing the papers back into their folder with hands that trembled slightly from either medication or emotion. Someone who can talk to grant committees and town councils, but also understands why Mrs. Patterson needs a place to buy her grandchildren's birthday presents without driving an hour to the mall. The scope of what he was asking began to sink in as I processed the architectural plans, the legal commitments, and the community impact projections. This wasn't a simple business turnaround, but a comprehensive community development project that would require skills I'd developed in my corporate career combined with roots and relationships I'd been running from for a decade. As I studied those plans, I realized Grandpa Joe hadn't just been dreaming, he'd been planning a revolution, and now he needed someone to lead it. That evening, I called for a family meeting at my parents' house carrying copies of Grandpa Joe's architectural plans and grant documents like they were sacred texts that might save us all. The familiar living room felt smaller than I remembered, crowded with the tension of unspoken grievances and the weight of a decision that would determine our family's future. Margaret had prepared coffee and arranged chairs in a careful circle, her nervous energy manifesting in the kind of meticulous hospitality she used to manage difficult conversations. Richard sat in his worn leather recliner, his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose as he studied the architectural drawings with the same methodical attention he'd once used to evaluate seed catalogs. Victoria curled up in the corner of the sofa, her arms wrapped around her knees in a defensive posture that reminded me painfully of our teenage years, when family discussions inevitably became battles over responsibility and expectations. I had no idea Dad was planning something this extensive, Margaret said, her voice carrying equal parts admiration and anxiety as she examined the grant approval letters. He never mentioned anything about working with Tom Peterson or getting approval from the town council. That's because he knew we'd try to talk him out of it, Richard said, his tone pragmatic rather than critical. Joe's always been a dreamer, but these fancy ideas require money we don't have and skills we don't possess. Look at this budget projection, $500,000 in construction costs alone, not counting equipment inventory or operating expenses for the first year. Victoria's reaction was more personal and consequently more painful to witness. She unfolded herself from the sofa and began pacing near the window, her movements sharp with hurt and indignation that had been building since yesterday's hospital visit. "I can't believe he shared all this with you first," she said, her voice tight with the kind of wounded pride that comes from feeling invisible in your own family. "I've been here working every day trying to keep the store alive, handling his medical appointments, managing the books, and he never said a word to me about community centers or grant applications or any of it." The accusation hung in the room like smoke, impossible to ignore, and equally impossible to completely dispel. I felt the familiar guilt of the family member who'd left rising in my chest, but I also recognized the deeper hurt beneath Victoria's anger, the fear that even her sacrifices weren't enough to earn the trust and respect she craved. Margaret immediately moved to mediate, her maternal instincts overriding the awkwardness of the situation. "Victoria, you know your grandfather loves you. He probably wanted to have all the details worked out before involving anyone else in case the grants fell through. Or maybe he knew that someone who's actually been managing the business might have practical concerns about taking on massive debt." Victoria shot back, her voice rising with frustration. "What if we fail and lose everything our family built? What if this community center idea is just another way to throw good money after bad?" Richard nodded gravely at his youngest daughter's concerns, and I could see him mentally calculating risks and worst-case scenarios with the careful pessimism of someone who'd watched small businesses fail throughout his lifetime. "Your sister raises valid points," he said, looking at me with the expression he'd used when I was 16 and proposing some scheme he considered poorly thought out. "This isn't just about having good intentions or fancy marketing plans. If we can't make the numbers work, we'll lose not just the store, but your grandfather's life savings and probably the family home too, since it's part of the collateral. I took a deep breath and launched into the presentation I'd been mentally preparing since leaving the hospital. Drawing on every skill I'd developed in my corporate career, I outlined how we could use targeted marketing to build community support, develop strategic partnerships to reduce costs, and create revenue streams that would make the community center financially sustainable rather than just a drain on family resources. I can write a comprehensive business plan that addresses the grant requirements, I said, spreading my own notes and calculations across the coffee table. We need to demonstrate community engagement, financial viability, and long-term sustainability. Those are exactly the kinds of challenges I deal with in my work every day. Victoria's laugh was sharp and bitter. Your work in Chicago, you mean? The job you'll be going back to in what, a week? 2 weeks. How exactly are you planning to manage a community center from 200 miles away? The question I'd been dreading hit the room like a physical blow. Dan shifted uncomfortably in his chair, and I could feel everyone's attention focusing on the commitment issue that lay at the heart of all our family tensions. I haven't figured out all the logistics yet, I admitted, feeling heat rise in my cheeks. But I could potentially take a leave of absence or work remotely on certain projects, or you could make the same promises you made 10 years ago about staying connected and being part of this family. Victoria interrupted, her voice thick with old hurt and fresh skepticism. Dan finally spoke up, his teacher's instincts for managing difficult group dynamics, overriding his usual reluctance to insert himself into Carter family drama. Liz is genuinely committed to helping, he said carefully. We both are. But Victoria's right that we need to be realistic about what that commitment looks like practically. We have a life in Chicago, jobs, financial obligations of our own. Any plan we make has to account for those realities. Before I could respond to the challenge implicit in Dan's diplomatic statement, we heard a car door slam in the driveway. Margaret glanced out the window and her face grew pale. It's Mrs. Henderson, she said, her voice carrying the kind of dread reserved for visits from people who only brought bad news. Emily Henderson, town councilwoman and wife of the bank president, entered our living room with the brisk efficiency of someone delivering information she'd rather not have to share. She declined Margaret's offer of coffee and got straight to the point with the directness that had made her a successful local politician. I'm sorry to interrupt your family meeting, she said, glancing at the architectural plans spread across our furniture. But I felt you needed to know immediately. Megamart's corporate development team contacted our office today. They're planning a major expansion that would include a full grocery section, pharmacy, and automotive service center. The words hit us like a punch to the stomach, but Mrs. Henderson wasn't finished delivering bad news. They're also actively looking to acquire properties in downtown Millbrook to prevent competition, she continued, her voice grave with implication. The expansion would essentially kill what's left of our local business district. Mrs. Henderson left us with devastating news. Megamart had made an offer to buy our building, and we had 30 days to decide. News travels fast in a town of 3,200 people, and by the next morning it seemed like everyone in Millbrook had heard about Megamart's offer and the 30-day deadline hanging over our family's decision. The reaction was as complicated as I'd expected, revealing fault lines in the community that went deeper than simple economics. When Dan and I stopped at Murphy's Diner for breakfast, conversations quieted as we entered, then resumed in hushed tones that made it clear we were the topic of discussion at every table. Old Mrs. Patterson approached our booth before we'd finished our coffee, her weathered hands clutching a worn purse as she struggled with words that clearly carried emotional weight. I've been shopping at Carter's since your great-grandfather ran the place, she said, her voice trembling slightly. It breaks my heart to think of it becoming another corporate storefront. But Liz, honey, I have to drive to Megamart twice a week now because I can't afford Carter's prices on my Social Security, and my arthritis makes it hard to make multiple trips when I can't find everything I need in one place. Her confession was both heartbreaking and illuminating, representing the impossible choice facing many of Millbrook's residents between loyalty to local business and the practical realities of fixed incomes and limited mobility. As we walked down Main Street afterward, I found myself seeing the town through different eyes, noticing details that painted a picture of a community caught between nostalgia and necessity. The reaction among local business owners was even more divided than I'd anticipated. At Johnson's hardware owner, Mike Johnson admitted he'd been quietly hoping Megamart's expansion might bring more foot traffic to downtown, reasoning that increased commercial activity would benefit everyone. But at Maria's beauty salon next door, Maria Santos expressed fears that Megamart's rumored plans to add a full-service salon would destroy the livelihood she'd built over 20 years. Some of these business owners think they can coexist with a corporate giant, Maria told me while cutting the hair of a customer who listened intently to every word. But I've seen what happens in other towns. First they compete on price until the locals can't survive, then they raise their prices once the competition is gone. The town meeting called for that Thursday evening packed the community center beyond capacity, forcing latecomers to stand along the walls and crowd into the doorway. Mayor Henderson opened the discussion by laying out the facts, Megamart's expansion plans, their offer to purchase Carter's General Store, and the broader implications for Millbrook's economic future. What followed was 3 hours of passionate debate that revealed just how much the community was struggling with changes that went far beyond retail competition. Sarah Williams, a young mother of 2, stood up to describe the difficulty of raising children in a town where opportunities seemed to disappear every year. My husband and I both grew up here, and we want our kids to have the same sense of community we had, she said, her voice carrying the frustration of someone trying to hold on to something that kept slipping away. But there's no movie theater anymore. The youth center closed last year, and now our kids spend all their time online because there's nothing else for them to do. Her comments opened a floodgate of similar concerns. Elderly residents talked about the challenge of accessing services when the nearest full-service bank was 20 minutes away and the local doctor had retired without replacement. Young adults described feeling pressured to leave town after high school because there were no career opportunities that matched their education and ambitions. Business owners detailed the struggle of maintaining inventory and competitive prices without the purchasing power of larger retailers. Jim Patterson, Mrs. Patterson's son and a local farmer, captured the complexity of the situation in a way that made everyone in the room uncomfortable. "I love Carter's General Store and I want to support local business," he said, his voice carrying the weight of practical experience. "But when I can buy the same bag of fertilizer at Megamart for $30 less, and my profit margins are already tight enough that $30 makes a difference in whether I can pay my mortgage that month, what choice do I really have?" The emotional climax of the meeting came when Victoria stood up to address the room. Her face flushed with a combination of nervousness and determination that reminded me of our childhood debates around the family dinner table. "I know everyone's looking to our family to make the right decision," she said, her voice starting quietly, but gaining strength as she continued. "But I need you all to understand that this isn't just about business economics for us. This is about whether the next generation of Carters has a future in Millbrook at all." She paused, glancing at me before continuing with words that I sensed carried personal significance beyond the community meeting. "My boyfriend Jake has been offered a job in Kansas City. Good salary, benefits, opportunity for advancement. Everything you can't find in a town this size. He's been asking me to come with him to start fresh somewhere that has a real future instead of just memories of better times." The admission sent a murmur through the crowd, and I felt a stab of understanding about pressures Victoria had been facing that went beyond the family business crisis. She was 28 years old, had sacrificed college and career opportunities to help keep Carter's afloat, and now faced the choice between continuing that sacrifice indefinitely or abandoning everything she'd worked for to pursue a life with actual possibilities. After the town meeting, Helen Martinez approached me with an idea that would prove more revealing than any official discussion. She'd been quietly organizing informal focus groups with different segments of the community, asking people to talk honestly about what they needed versus what they were actually getting from local businesses and services. "The results might surprise you," Helen said as she handed me a folder of notes from her conversations. "People aren't as resistant to change as you might think. They're frustrated because they feel like they have to choose between supporting their community and meeting their family's practical needs. The focus group findings painted a picture of a community hungry for innovation but skeptical about whether local businesses could deliver it. Parents wanted after-school programs and youth activities but couldn't find reliable childcare or enrichment opportunities. Seniors needed services that accommodated mobility challenges and fixed incomes, but often felt ignored by businesses focused on younger, more affluent customers. Young professionals wanted networking opportunities and cultural activities, but saw no evidence that Millbrook could provide urban amenities in a small-town setting. After listening to the community's real needs, I understood why Grandpa Joe's vision was so important, but I also realized why it might be impossible to achieve. The weight of the community's conflicting needs and expectations followed me home that night. But it was nothing compared to the pressure that awaited me the next morning when my boss called from Chicago. Jennifer Brennan's voice carried the kind of controlled impatience that meant she'd already made up her mind about whatever conversation we were about to have. "Liz, I understand you're dealing with a family emergency, but we need to know your timeline for returning," she said without preamble. "The Morrison account is demanding answers about their Q1 campaign, and frankly, your absence is creating problems I can't keep solving with temporary solutions." I found myself pacing the small hotel room as I tried to explain a situation that sounded increasingly surreal when spoken aloud to someone whose world consisted of quarterly reports and client presentations. The idea of taking a 6-month leave of absence to save a small-town general store by transforming it into a community center seemed like something from a different universe than the one where Jennifer and I had built successful careers. "6 months is out of the question," she said flatly when I finished my explanation. "We can hold your position for 3 weeks, maybe 4 if you're willing to work remotely on critical projects. But Liz, I have to be honest, if you walk away from your responsibilities here for half a year, there won't be a job waiting for you when you get back." The ultimatum hung in the air like smoke after she ended the call. Dan found me sitting on the edge of the bed staring at my phone as if it might offer some alternative to the impossible choice I was facing. "What did she say?" he asked, though my expression had probably already given him the answer. "Either I come back within a month, or I don't come back at all." I said the words feeling strange in my mouth. "She's not willing to hold my position for the kind of commitment this project would require." Dan sat down beside me, and I could feel him processing the implications with the same methodical approach he used for everything from lesson plans to major life decisions. His silence stretched long enough that I knew he was struggling with conflicts of his own. "I want to support whatever decision you make," he said, finally, his voice careful in the way that meant he was trying to balance honesty with encouragement. "But I have to admit the idea of both of us walking away from stable careers to gamble everything on a project that might not work, it scares me, Liz. We've worked so hard to build financial security, and small business failure rates are brutal, especially in rural areas." His concerns were valid and practical, exactly the kind of rational analysis that had made our marriage successful for 7 years. But they also highlighted the magnitude of what I was considering sacrificing for a community that had never been entirely sure it wanted me to stay. That afternoon's visit to the hospital brought unexpected developments that complicated the decision even further. Grandpa Joe was sitting up in bed, his color noticeably better, and his voice stronger than it had been since my arrival. Dr. Patterson's cautiously optimistic report suggested that his recovery was progressing faster than expected, but her warnings about stress and its potential impact on his cardiac health cast a shadow over the encouraging news. "Any major upheaval or disappointment could trigger another stroke," she explained privately while Grandpa Joe napped. "His emotional investment in that store runs deeper than most people realize. The prospect of losing it entirely might be more stress than his heart can handle right now." The medical reality added another layer of pressure to a decision that was already overwhelming in its complexity. It wasn't just about business success or family expectations anymore, it was potentially about my grandfather's survival. That evening, Margaret pulled me aside in the hospital parking lot and for the first time since I'd returned to Millbrook, I saw my mother without the composed facade she'd maintained throughout our family crisis. Her exhaustion was written in the lines around her eyes, and the way she leaned against her car as if standing required more energy than she could easily spare. "I need to tell you something I haven't shared with your father or Victoria," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been working 2 jobs since last winter, cleaning offices at night after spending days at the store. We haven't been able to pay ourselves a salary in 8 months, and I've been using the cleaning money to cover basic household expenses." The confession hit me like a physical blow. My mother, who had always taken pride in being the organized foundation of our family, had been working herself into exhaustion trying to hold everything together while protecting everyone else from knowing how desperate things had become. "Mom, why didn't you tell us?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. The Carter family had always believed in solving their own problems, and admitting the depth of their financial crisis would have felt like failure. "Because I kept thinking we could find a solution that wouldn't require anyone to make impossible sacrifices," she said, tears finally spilling over despite her efforts to maintain composure. "But maybe that's not realistic anymore." Later that evening, Richard surprised me by initiating a conversation that revealed vulnerabilities I'd never seen him express. We were sitting on the porch of my parents' house, watching the sun set over farmland that had remained essentially unchanged since my childhood, when he began talking about his own limitations in a way that showed genuine humility. "I know the business needs to modernize," he said, his voice carrying the weight of someone admitting a truth he'd been avoiding. "I see what's happening to small towns all over Illinois, and I understand that doing things the same way we've always done them isn't going to work anymore. But Liz, I feel completely inadequate to lead the kind of changes your grandfather is envisioning. I don't understand grant applications or business plans or marketing strategies. I'm good at fixing broken equipment and maintaining relationships with suppliers, but that's not enough anymore." His admission of inadequacy was both heartbreaking and illuminating, helping me understand why the family had been paralyzed by indecision, despite recognizing the need for change. They knew what needed to happen, but felt completely unprepared to make it happen. The conversation that finally crystallized my decision came the next morning when Victoria appeared at my hotel room door with coffee and the kind of determined expression that meant she'd been rehearsing what she wanted to say. "I'll give your plan a chance," she said without preamble, "but only if you commit to staying through completion, not just visiting long enough to write a business plan and then disappearing back to Chicago. This community center idea, if it's going to work, it needs someone who's actually invested in making it succeed, not someone who's just trying to ease their guilt about leaving." Her conditions were fair but daunting, requiring me to choose between the career I'd built and the family legacy I'd inherited. As I looked around at my family's hopeful but worried faces, I knew that saying yes would mean risking everything Dan and I had built, but saying no might destroy everything Grandpa Joe had dreamed of. The moment I said the words, "I'm staying," the atmosphere in my parents' living room shifted like weather changing before a storm. Victoria's shoulders sagged with what looked like relief mixed with disbelief, while Margaret pressed her hand to her chest as if she needed to steady her heartbeat. Richard nodded slowly, the gesture carrying both approval and the weight of understanding, exactly what I'd just committed to undertake. 6 months, I said, looking each family member in the eye to make sure they understood the scope of what we were attempting. "I'll take an unpaid leave of absence and dedicate myself completely to making Grandpa Joe's vision a reality. But I need everyone to understand that this isn't just about good intentions anymore. We're going to have to work harder and smarter than this family has ever worked before." Dan's response came after a pause that felt like an eternity but probably lasted only seconds. When he spoke, his voice carried the careful tone of someone who'd spent hours thinking through implications and contingencies. "I can negotiate a sabbatical from the school district," he said, reaching for my hand in a gesture that felt both supportive and protective. "They have provisions for teachers pursuing advanced degrees or family emergencies. It won't be paid leave, but they'll hold my position through the end of the school year and guarantee my job will be waiting if we need to return to Chicago." The "if" in his statement wasn't lost on anyone in the room, and I felt grateful for his diplomatic way of expressing support while maintaining the practical escape route that his cautious nature required. Margaret immediately began making lists of everything that would need to be accomplished, her organizational instincts kicking into overdrive now that we had a definite plan of action. Our first official family work session the next morning at Carter's General Store revealed the true depth of the challenge we'd taken on. Victoria unlocked the front door with the resigned efficiency of someone who'd been carrying too much responsibility alone for too long, then led us through a comprehensive assessment that was both educational and sobering. The inventory system consisted of handwritten ledgers that hadn't been updated systematically in over 2 years, making it impossible to determine which products were profitable and which were simply taking up shelf space. The customer database was essentially non-existent. A shoebox filled with index cards containing names and addresses of people who'd made special orders, but no systematic tracking of purchasing patterns, preferences, or contact information that could support targeted marketing efforts. "We've been running on memory and habit," Victoria admitted as she showed us the cramped office where financial records were stored in filing cabinets that looked like they'd survived several decades of indifferent maintenance. Grandpa Joe knew every customer personally remembered what they usually bought and when they needed it, but none of that knowledge was ever systematized in a way that the rest of us could use. Dan proved unexpectedly valuable during this assessment process, his teacher's instincts for organization and systematic analysis, helping us categorize problems into manageable components. He set up spreadsheets on his laptop to track our findings, creating databases that would allow us to measure progress and identify priorities as we worked through the transformation process. Victoria's agreement to full partnership came with clearly defined boundaries that demonstrated she'd learned important lessons about protecting herself from being overwhelmed by other people's expectations. She would continue managing day-to-day store operations and customer service, but she wanted specific areas of responsibility rather than being treated as a general assistant who could handle whatever tasks others didn't want to tackle. "I know this store's customers, suppliers, and daily rhythms better than anyone except Grandpa Joe," she said with confidence that I hadn't heard in her voice since returning to Millbrook. "But I don't know anything about grant applications or community organizing or business plan development, and I don't want to pretend I do. Let me do what I'm good at while you handle the parts that require your expertise." Richard and Margaret's commitment to supporting our new direction was complicated by their obvious anxiety about departing from traditional approaches that had sustained the family business for decades. Richard spent considerable time studying Grandpa Joe's architectural plans, asking detailed questions about construction costs and timeline requirements that demonstrated both genuine interest and practical concern about our ability to execute such an ambitious project. "I'm willing to learn new ways of doing things," he said during one of our planning sessions, "but I need to understand how these changes connect to the values that made this business successful in the first place. We can't lose sight of personal service and community relationships while we're chasing grants and modern marketing strategies." Margaret's support manifested in her determination to master unfamiliar technologies and administrative processes that would be essential for grant compliance and project management. She enrolled in a computer class at the community college and began learning spreadsheet software with the same methodical persistence she'd applied to mastering everything else that had been required of her as a small business owner's wife. The community survey we conducted during our second week of intensive planning revealed both encouraging interest and sobering skepticism about our community center concept. Helen Martinez coordinated the distribution and collection of surveys, managing to reach nearly 300 households with questions about their interest in various services and programs we were considering. 63% of respondents expressed enthusiasm about the concept of a community center that would combine retail, social services, and cultural programming. However, when asked about their willingness to actively participate in or financially support such a venture, the numbers dropped significantly. Only 38% indicated they would be likely to attend programs regularly, and less than 20% expressed confidence that the project could succeed given Millbrook's history of failed business ventures. The grant application deadline felt like a sword hanging over everything we attempted to accomplish. 5 months to design and implement a community engagement strategy, develop a comprehensive business plan, demonstrate measurable progress toward our goals, and convince skeptical review committees that our small-town project deserved $500,000 in state funding. The timeline required us to show significant achievement almost immediately, with no allowance for the learning curve that typically accompanies major career transitions. James Morrison, our family lawyer, scheduled weekly check-ins to ensure we remained on track with all legal and financial requirements for both the grant application and the business restructuring that would be necessary if our project succeeded. His systematic approach helped us understand that we weren't just trying to save a failing store, we were attempting to create an entirely new type of business entity that would require careful navigation of regulations governing retail operations, nonprofit activities, and community development initiatives. As we shook hands on our new partnership, I realized I'd just committed to either creating a miracle or watching 4 generations of family legacy crumble under my leadership. The euphoria of making a commitment lasted exactly 1 week, which was how long it took for reality to systematically dismantle every assumption I'd made about the feasibility of our community center project. What began as an optimistic assessment of renovation needs quickly transformed into a sobering education about the difference between architectural dreams and structural reality. Tom Peterson, the architect who'd worked with Grandpa Joe on the community center plans, arrived Monday morning with Mike Rodriguez, a contractor whose reputation for honest assessments had earned him work throughout 3 counties. What was supposed to be a routine building inspection to confirm renovation costs turned into a 3-hour exploration that revealed problems I hadn't even known to look for. The electrical system hasn't been updated since 1978, Mike explained as he examined junction boxes behind displays that hadn't been moved in decades. Current codes require complete rewiring for any commercial renovation of this scope, plus upgraded service panels and emergency lighting systems. The plumbing has similar issues: cast iron pipes that are corroded beyond repair, and a septic system that won't handle the increased capacity you're planning. The structural concerns were even more daunting. Water damage from years of deferred roof maintenance had compromised several support beams, and the foundation showed settling that would require reinforcement before any major renovation could begin. Mike's preliminary estimate exceeded our available budget by 40%, and that was before considering costs for specialized features like commercial kitchen equipment or accessibility modifications that would be required for grant compliance. "I hate to be the bearer of bad news," Mike said as he compiled his findings into a report that felt like a death sentence for our project. "But you're looking at infrastructure investments that will eat up most of your budget before you even begin the renovations that make this place into a community center." My carefully crafted business plan, which had seemed so thorough during family meetings, met with polite but firm resistance when I presented it to First National Bank the following morning. Loan officer Patricia Hendricks, a woman in her 50s, who'd seen decades of small-town business ventures succeed and fail, listened to my presentation with the kind of professional attention that couldn't quite mask her fundamental skepticism. "Ms. Wilson, I appreciate the thought you've put into this proposal," she said, her tone diplomatic but discouraging. "But community centers are typically funded by municipalities or large nonprofit organizations, not family businesses trying to reinvent themselves. The financial projections assume revenue streams that don't exist yet, and community support that may not materialize once people understand what you're asking them to commit to." Her concerns weren't unreasonable, but they highlighted a gap between grant requirements and practical financing that I hadn't fully considered. The state funding was contingent on demonstrating local financial commitment, but local lenders were reluctant to invest in a concept they considered experimental and risky. Victoria's personal struggles added another layer of complexity to our professional challenges. Jake Morrison, her boyfriend of 2 years, had initially been supportive of our family's efforts to save the store, but as the scope and timeline of our commitment became clear, his attitude shifted toward increasingly vocal opposition. "You're wasting your life on a losing venture," he told Victoria during what was supposed to be a quiet dinner at Murphy's Diner, his voice carrying across the small restaurant in a way that made our family drama public entertainment. This community center idea is just another way for your sister to feel good about herself before she goes back to her real life in Chicago, leaving you holding the bag like always. Victoria's defense of our project was passionate, but I could see the doubt creeping into her eyes as Jake continued to pressure her with practical arguments about their future together. His job offer in Kansas City came with a salary that would allow them to buy a house, start a family, and build a life that didn't depend on the uncertain economics of rural business development. Dan's own moment of doubt came when he visited Millbrook High School to discuss the possibility of a teaching position that would allow us to remain in town permanently. Principal Linda Washington was enthusiastic about having a teacher with his experience and qualifications. But the salary she could offer was less than half what he earned in Chicago, with fewer benefits and limited opportunities for professional advancement. I knew it would be less money. Dan told me that evening as we walked through downtown Millbrook past storefronts that had been empty for years. But I didn't realize how much less. If we stay here permanently, we'll be taking a step backward financially that might take decades to recover from, assuming the community center succeeds at all. The community focus groups that Helen Martinez had organized with such enthusiasm began revealing divisions that were deeper and more complicated than simple resistance to change. Older residents, many of whom had known Grandpa Joe since childhood, expressed strong emotional support for preserving the store's traditional role in community life. But when pressed for specifics about what services they would actually use and pay for their responses, revealed expectations that were both unrealistic and contradictory. "I want the store to stay like it always was," said Ernest Mueller, an 82-year-old farmer whose family had shopped at Carter's for 4 generations. "But I also want it to have everything I need so I don't have to drive to Megamart. And I want prices that don't hurt people on fixed incomes like me." Younger families expressed different but equally challenging demands. They wanted modern amenities, extended hours, and services that would justify choosing local business over corporate convenience. But they were reluctant to commit to the higher prices that would be necessary to fund such improvements. Sarah Williams, the young mother who'd spoken passionately at the town meeting, summed up the generational divide in a way that made my heart sink. "I love the idea of a community center," she said during one focus group session. "But honestly, if it's going to be run like the old general store, limited hours, high prices, and inventory that's hit or miss, then I'll probably still end up doing most of my shopping at Megamart and just feeling guilty about it." The pressure from Megamart's corporate representatives intensified as word of our community center plans spread through the business community. Their improved buyout offer arrived exactly 3 weeks after our initial commitment, accompanied by a professionally prepared presentation that outlined their expansion plans and emphasized the economic benefits their larger operation would bring to Millbrook. The offer had increased by nearly 30%, and it came with guarantees of employment for existing Carter's employees and commitments to maintain some local supplier relationships. For a family struggling with renovation costs that exceeded their resources and community support that remained uncertain, the corporate offer represented a tempting escape from an increasingly overwhelming challenge. Just when I thought we'd identified all our challenges, I discovered the biggest obstacle might be the very community we were trying to serve. The discovery that our biggest challenges might come from within the community we were trying to serve proved prophetic, as family tensions began surfacing with alarming frequency during our 4th week of intensive planning. Richard, who had initially expressed cautious support for modernization, began questioning every proposal that deviated from traditional retail approaches, his resistance growing stronger each time we discussed changes that would transform Carter's familiar atmosphere. "These computer terminals for inventory tracking are going to make the place look like a corporate chain store," he said during a heated discussion about point-of-sale systems that would be required for grant compliance. "Customers come here because it feels like a real place run by real people, not because they want to scan barcodes and interact with machines. We're going to lose the personal touch that made this store special in the first place." His concerns reflected deeper fears about losing traditional values that had defined both the business and his own identity for decades. Every suggestion about streamlining operations or implementing modern retail practices triggered defensive responses that revealed how much change threatened his sense of purpose and competence within the family enterprise. Victoria's struggles were more complex and consequently more heartbreaking to witness. The marketing responsibilities I'd assigned her, which had seemed like natural extensions of her customer service skills, were overwhelming someone who'd never been asked to think strategically about brand development or community outreach. She spent hours each evening trying to master social media platforms and demographic analysis tools, her frustration mounting as she fell further behind on tasks that came naturally to me but felt impossibly foreign to her experience. Jake's ultimatum had evolved from gentle pressure into increasingly aggressive demands that Victoria choose between their relationship and what he described as your family's hopeless fantasy project. His threats to leave Millbrook without her came with specific deadlines and job opportunities that forced Victoria to confront the possibility that supporting our community center might cost her the personal future she'd been building with the man she loved. He got a promotion offer in Kansas City that requires an answer by next month. Victoria told me during one of our planning sessions, her voice tight with stress that had been building for weeks. He says if I'm not ready to choose him over this project, then he needs to find someone who will prioritize their own life over other people's dreams. Margaret's private anxiety about family finances added another layer of pressure that she tried to hide from everyone but couldn't completely conceal from someone who'd learned to read her expressions during childhood. The medical bills from Grandpa Joe's hospitalization and ongoing care were substantial enough that she'd had to negotiate payment plans with multiple providers, and the prospect of taking on additional debt for renovation costs was keeping her awake at night with worries she couldn't voice without undermining family morale. I discovered the extent of her financial concerns when I found her in the store's office at 6 a.m, surrounded by insurance statements and medical bills that she'd been trying to organize before anyone else arrived for work. The dark circles under her eyes and the defeated slump of her shoulders told a story of sleepless nights spent calculating numbers that never seemed to add up to manageable totals. The insurance covered most of the emergency treatment, she admitted when I pressed her for details. But the ongoing cardiac care and physical therapy costs are eating up everything we've managed to save. I don't know how we're going to afford renovation expenses when we're already struggling to keep up with basic household and medical obligations. The resistance from longtime customers proved more personally painful than I'd anticipated, partially because their complaints challenged my understanding of what the community actually wanted from our family business. Mrs. Patterson, whose loyalty to Carter's had seemed unshakable, expressed frustration about changes to the store layout that made it harder for her to find familiar products in their traditional locations. "I've been shopping here for 40 years. She told Victoria with the kind of wounded disappointment that cuts deeper than anger. "And now I feel like a stranger in a place that used to feel like home. I understand you need to modernize, but it's like you're trying to erase everything that made this store special." Similar complaints came from other elderly customers who'd developed shopping routines and relationships that our efficiency improvements were inadvertently disrupting. The computerized inventory system that would help us manage stock more effectively also eliminated the informal consultation process through which longtime customers had received personalized service and product recommendations. The local newspaper editorial that appeared on Thursday morning felt like a public betrayal of our efforts, even though editor Bob Williams had framed his criticism in terms of economic pragmatism rather than personal attack. The headline, "Nostalgia Doesn't Pay Bills," was followed by an analysis that questioned the wisdom of rejecting Megamart's offer in favor of an experimental project that might fail and leave the community worse off than before. The Carter family's commitment to their community center vision is admirable. Williams wrote, "But good intentions don't guarantee success, and failed business ventures can have lasting negative impacts on small communities that are already struggling economically. Sometimes the responsible choice is to accept change rather than fight it, especially when that change comes with concrete benefits like jobs and economic stability. The town council meeting that followed the editorial became a heated debate between progress supporters and tradition defenders that revealed how deeply our project had divided the community along generational and ideological lines. Older residents spoke passionately about preserving Millbrook's character and supporting local business, while younger families questioned whether nostalgia was worth the economic sacrifices that supporting local commerce required. The debate grew particularly intense when Jim Patterson challenged the community center concept, directly arguing that rural areas needed to accept economic realities rather than chase unrealistic dreams about recreating past prosperity. "I want to support the Carter family," he said, his voice carrying the frustration of someone caught between loyalty and practicality. "But I also have responsibilities to my own family that require me to make decisions based on facts rather than hopes. If this community center fails, we'll have lost both the traditional store and the opportunity to benefit from Megamart's expansion." Listening to the heated exchanges, I began to understand how much I'd underestimated the extent to which change threatened people's sense of identity and security. For many residents, Carter's General Store wasn't just a retail establishment, but a symbol of continuity in a world that seemed to be transforming too rapidly for them to maintain their footing. When I found Victoria crying in the stockroom after another confrontation with Jake, I realized our family wasn't the only relationship being tested by this project. The emotional strain that had been building within our family reached a breaking point the following Monday morning when Victoria called an emergency meeting that felt more like a confession than a business discussion. She sat across from us at the kitchen table in my parents' house, her hands shaking slightly as she delivered news that would force us all to confront the personal costs of our community center ambitions. "Jake gave me an ultimatum last night," she said, her voice barely steady enough to get the words out. "He got the promotion in Kansas City, and he needs an answer within 2 weeks. He's tired of feeling like he's competing with the family business for my attention, and he doesn't believe this community center project is ever going to succeed." The silence that followed her announcement was filled with the kind of tension that accompanies moments when families realize they're facing choices that will alter relationships permanently. Margaret reached across the table to take Victoria's hand, her maternal instincts overriding the complicated emotions that our project had stirred up over the past several weeks. "What are you going to tell him?" Margaret asked quietly, though I could see in her expression that she already feared the answer. "I don't know." Victoria admitted, tears finally spilling over despite her efforts to maintain composure. "I love him, and I want a future that includes marriage and children and financial security. But I also can't bear the thought of abandoning you all right now when everything depends on us working together." Richard's response to Victoria's crisis triggered the worst fight I'd witnessed between my parents in decades. What began as a discussion about family priorities quickly escalated into accusations and recriminations that revealed how much stress had been accumulating beneath the surface of their marriage. "This is exactly what I was afraid would happen," Richard said, his voice rising with frustration that had clearly been building for weeks. "We're risking our daughter's happiness and our family's future on Liz's fancy ideas about community centers and grant money. We've gotten so caught up in chasing dreams that we've forgotten about the real consequences for real people." Margaret's defense of our project was fierce, but tinged with her own doubts about the wisdom of the path we'd chosen. "Richard Carter, we agreed to support this decision as a family." She shot back, her usually controlled demeanor cracking under the pressure of trying to hold everyone together. "You can't blame Liz for problems that existed long before she came home. This store was failing with or without her community center plans." Their argument continued for nearly an hour, covering decades of unresolved disagreements about business decisions, family responsibilities, and the balance between security and ambition. Listening to them fight over choices I'd initiated made me feel responsible for damage that might prove irreparable regardless of whether our project succeeded or failed. Dan's phone call that afternoon brought another crisis that tested our commitment from a different angle. The Chicago School District had contacted him with an unexpected opportunity, a department head position that would represent a significant advancement in his career, but required an immediate decision due to the timing of their hiring cycle. "It's exactly the kind of position I've been working toward for years," he told me as we walked through downtown Millbrook, past the empty storefronts that had become symbols of either our community's decline or its potential for renewal depending on your perspective. "The salary would be almost double what I make now, and it would put me on track for administrative roles that could lead to a principal position within 5 years. The opportunity came with a non-negotiable timeline that would force us to abandon our community center project just as we were beginning to make progress toward grant deadlines. Dan had 30 days to accept the position or lose it permanently, and his decision would determine whether we could sustain our commitment to remaining in Millbrook beyond the initial 6-month timeline. "I don't want to pressure you," Dan continued, though I could hear the internal conflict in his voice. "But we need to be realistic about whether this project is actually viable or whether we're just postponing the inevitable return to our real lives in Chicago." The following day brought news that Grandpa Joe had experienced what Dr. Patterson described as a minor setback, not serious enough to require intensive care, but concerning enough to raise questions about whether the stress of our transformation efforts was affecting his recovery. His blood pressure had spiked during a conversation about construction delays, and he'd complained of chest tightness that triggered emergency monitoring protocols. "I can't definitively say the business stress is causing his cardiac issues," Dr. Patterson explained to our assembled family. "But I also can't rule it out. At his age and with his medical history, any additional stress needs to be carefully managed to prevent more serious complications." The bank's official rejection of our loan application arrived the same day as Grandpa Joe's medical scare delivered by Patricia Hendricks, with the kind of professional sympathy that couldn't soften the devastating impact of her decision. First National's loan committee had concluded that our community center concept represented too high a risk for the amount of funding we were requesting leaving our renovation plans without the financial foundation necessary for implementation. "I'm genuinely sorry," Patricia said as she explained the bank's decision, "but the committee felt that the combination of unproven revenue projections, extensive renovation requirements, and uncertain community support made this an unacceptable lending risk, especially given the family's current debt obligations." Anonymous complaints to the county health department triggered an inspection that revealed code violations serious enough to require immediate attention regardless of our renovation plans. The inspector found issues with food storage temperatures, inadequate ventilation in areas where we sold household chemicals, and documentation problems related to our informal food service operation that had been operating without proper permits for years. "These violations aren't necessarily deal breakers for your community center project," the inspector explained as he compiled his report. "But they'll need to be addressed before you can proceed with any expansion of food service operations, and some of them require immediate correction to maintain your current retail license." The community meeting that was supposed to address concerns about our project descended into a shouting match that made local newspaper headlines and left our family feeling more isolated than ever. Supporters and opponents of the community center faced off across the room with arguments that quickly became personal attacks on character and motives rather than substantive discussions about community development. "This whole project is just about making the Carter family feel important," shouted one opponent whose identity was obscured by the chaos of multiple conversations happening simultaneously. "They're willing to risk the economic future of this entire town to satisfy their own egos and avoid admitting they can't compete in a modern economy." As I stood in the empty store that night, surrounded by violation notices and rejection letters, I wondered if trying to save our legacy was actually going to destroy our family. The despair that had settled over our family, like a heavy blanket, began to lift in the most unexpected way. When Helen Martinez appeared at the store on Thursday morning, her expression carrying the kind of controlled excitement that suggested she'd been keeping an important secret until the right moment to reveal it. She waited until the morning customers had left, and Victoria had finished processing the daily inventory reports before approaching me with a manila folder that would transform our understanding of what might be possible. I've been having conversations with people you might not expect, Helen said, settling into the chair across from my makeshift desk in the store's cramped office. The Potawatomi Cultural Council has been watching your community center project with interest, and they have a proposal that could solve several of your problems at once. The revelation that the local Native American tribe was interested in partnering with our project came as a complete surprise, particularly since none of us had considered the possibility of cultural collaboration as part of our community development strategy. Helen explained that tribal council members had been following our grant application process and saw opportunities for cultural exchange and economic development that would benefit both the tribal community and Millbrook residents. They've been looking for ways to share their cultural heritage with the broader community, while also supporting economic development that doesn't compromise their values. Helen continued opening the folder to reveal documents that outlined a comprehensive partnership proposal. The community center concept fits perfectly with their vision of creating spaces where different cultures can learn from each other while working together on practical projects. The tribal council's offer included matching funds that would cover nearly 40% of our renovation costs, along with expertise in sustainable building practices and community organizing that would strengthen our grant applications significantly. More importantly, the partnership would bring an authentic cultural component to our community center that would distinguish it from other rural development projects and attract visitors from across the region. They're particularly interested in creating a cultural education space where tribal elders can share traditional knowledge with young people from both communities, Helen explained, pointing to architectural drawings that showed how our existing plans could be modified to include dedicated areas for workshops, demonstrations, and cultural events. It would be a living museum and active learning center rather than just a display of artifacts. Victoria's reaction to the tribal partnership proposal surprised everyone, including herself. Rather than viewing it as another complication in an already complex project, she saw it as an opportunity to connect with other young adults who shared her desire to create reasons for staying in rural communities rather than abandoning them for urban opportunities. "Sarah Williams called me yesterday," Victoria said, her voice carrying more energy than I'd heard since our project began. "She's been talking with other parents about the cultural education possibilities, and they're excited about their children learning directly from tribal elders about local history and environmental stewardship. It's exactly the kind of programming that would make families want to participate actively instead of just shopping occasionally." The enthusiasm Victoria discovered among her peer group revealed a community dynamic I hadn't fully understood. Young adults in Millbrook weren't necessarily opposed to staying in their hometown. They were frustrated by the lack of opportunities to contribute meaningfully to community development and cultural enrichment. The tribal partnership offered a model for collaboration that would allow different generations and cultures to work together on projects that served everyone's interests. Dan's breakthrough came when he visited the community college campus to explore teaching opportunities that might allow us to remain in Millbrook without completely sacrificing his career advancement. What began as a courtesy meeting with the academic dean turned into a discussion about innovative programs that could serve both the college's mission and our community center's educational goals. "They're launching a rural community development certificate program next fall," Dan explained after returning from his campus visit, his excitement evident in the way he described possibilities I hadn't even considered. "They need instructors who understand both educational theory and practical community organizing, and they're willing to structure the position so I could teach part-time while coordinating educational programs at the community center." The arrangement would provide Dan with the intellectual stimulation and professional development he needed while allowing us to maintain our commitment to the community center project. More importantly, it would create formal connections between our local initiative and broader educational resources that could strengthen both our programming and our grant application. The local artist cooperative's offer to donate renovation labor in exchange for permanent gallery space represented another breakthrough that addressed both financial and programming challenges simultaneously. Led by Maria Santos, whose beauty salon had become an informal gathering place for creative professionals throughout the county, The cooperative included painters, sculptors, woodworkers, and textile artists who saw our community center as an opportunity to display and sell their work while contributing to community development. "We've been meeting in church basements and community center conference rooms for years," Maria explained during a meeting that brought together artists from 3 different counties. "Having dedicated studio and gallery space would allow us to offer workshops, host events, and create a cultural destination that draws visitors to Millbrook, instead of requiring us to travel to larger cities for opportunities." The most encouraging development came through an unexpected phone call from Janet Morrison, a member of the State Grant Review Committee who had been following our application process with personal interest. Speaking carefully to avoid any appearance of impropriety, she suggested that our revised application emphasizing cultural partnership and community collaboration was exactly the kind of innovative approach the committee was hoping to fund. "Rural development grants are most successful when they demonstrate genuine community engagement and sustainable programming rather than just infrastructure improvements," she said during a conversation that felt like professional mentoring rather than official guidance. "Your tribal partnership and educational components suggest that this project could serve as a model for other communities facing similar challenges." Just as hope began to return, we discovered that accepting the tribal partnership would require us to confront a painful truth about Millbrook's history that no one wanted to discuss. The painful truth Helen had alluded to emerged gradually through research that the Tribal Council required before finalizing any partnership agreement, revealing layers of local history that had been carefully omitted from official town records and family stories passed down through generations. What began as routine documentation for grant applications became an uncomfortable education about the foundations upon which Millbrook's prosperity had been built. County historical records showed that the land currently occupied by our town had been acquired through an 1847 treaty that tribal historians characterized as coercive and legally questionable negotiated during a period when Native American communities throughout Illinois were under intense pressure to relocate westward. The treaty had transferred thousands of acres of prime agricultural land to white settlers for compensation that tribal records indicated was far below fair market value and was never fully paid. The community's reaction to this historical revelation split along lines that had little to do with our community center project and everything to do with deeply held beliefs about property rights, historical responsibility, and cultural identity that many residents had never been forced to examine directly. Some community members expressed concerns that acknowledging historical injustices might somehow threaten current land ownership or property values, while others worried that partnering with tribal representatives implied acceptance of guilt for events that had occurred generations before their births. "I don't understand why we need to dig up old grievances that nobody alive today had anything to do with," complained Jim Patterson during a tense discussion at Murphy's Diner that I witnessed firsthand. "My family worked hard for everything we have, and we're not responsible for what happened in the 1800s. This partnership sounds like it's more about making white people feel guilty than actually helping anyone." The resistance I encountered wasn't necessarily rooted in conscious racism, but rather in the kind of defensive thinking that emerges when people feel their fundamental understanding of their community's identity is being challenged. Many longtime residents had grown up with stories about pioneer ancestors who had struggled to build successful farms and businesses through hard work and determination, and the suggestion that their prosperity might have been built on injustice threatened narratives that had shaped their sense of family pride for generations. Grandpa Joe's revelation about our own family's history came during a hospital visit that I'd expected to be routine, but turned into a confession that reframed everything I thought I knew about Carter's General Store's origins. His decision to share family secrets that he'd kept hidden for decades seemed prompted by his recognition that the tribal partnership might represent our last opportunity to address historical wrongs while building something positive for the future. My grandfather Samuel didn't just succeed because he was a good businessman. Grandpa Joe said, his voice carrying the weight of someone sharing a burden he'd carried alone for too long. He maintained trading relationships with tribal members who stayed in the area after the forced relocations, even though it was socially disapproved of and sometimes legally risky. Those relationships gave him access to furs crafts and agricultural products that he couldn't have obtained through conventional suppliers. The family secret that Grandpa Joe revealed painted a picture of economic success that was more complex and morally ambiguous than the simple immigrant success story our family had always celebrated. Samuel Carter had indeed been hardworking and innovative, but his prosperity had also depended on maintaining business relationships with people whose communities had been displaced to make room for settlers like himself. He never talked about it publicly because it would have hurt his reputation in town, Grandpa Joe continued. But he made sure those tribal families were paid fairly and treated with respect, which was more than most white businessmen were willing to do. I think he understood that his success was connected to their loss, and he tried to honor that connection even when it was difficult. This revelation helped me understand why the Community Center project felt like more than just economic development. It represented an opportunity for healing historical wounds through collaboration rather than continued separation. The partnership with the Tribal Council offered a chance to acknowledge past injustices while working together on initiatives that would benefit everyone involved. Victoria's emergence as a liaison with tribal youth surprised everyone, including herself, but it represented the kind of natural bridge building that our partnership needed to succeed. Her conversations with young tribal members revealed shared experiences of feeling caught between preserving cultural traditions and adapting to modern economic realities that resonated with her own struggles about staying in Millbrook versus pursuing opportunities elsewhere. They understand what it's like to love your community but feel frustrated by limited opportunities. Victoria told me after spending an afternoon at a tribal youth center that operated programs similar to what we hoped to create. They're dealing with the same questions about how to honor their heritage while building futures that don't require abandoning everything they care about. Richard's reaction to learning about our family's hidden history demonstrated the internal conflict that many community members experienced when confronted with information that complicated their understanding of local identity. His initial response was defensive, focused on protecting the reputation of ancestors he'd always admired, but his eventual acceptance came through recognition that moral complexity didn't necessarily diminish the positive contributions earlier generations had made. "I don't like learning that our family's success was built on relationships we kept secret," he admitted during a difficult conversation that lasted well into the evening. "But I also can't argue with doing what's right instead of just what's profitable. If this partnership gives us a chance to honor both our grandfather's business sense and his moral instincts, then maybe that's how we should move forward." The community meeting that was supposed to finalize support for the tribal partnership became an educational forum about local history that changed some minds while solidifying others' opposition. Tribal historian Robert Crow Feather presented documentation about pre-settlement land use and the treaty negotiations that had transferred ownership to white settlers, while local historian Ellen Morrison shared research about early business relationships between tribal communities and Millbrook's founding families. When tribal elder Mary Crow Feather stood up at the meeting to share her grandmother's memories of trading with my great-grandfather, I realized our family legacy was more complicated than I ever imagined. Mary Crow Feather's emotional testimony about her grandmother's relationship with my great-grandfather became the catalyst that transformed scattered supporters into a unified coalition dedicated to making our community center vision a reality. In the days following that pivotal community meeting, an unlikely alliance began forming between groups that had never worked together before. Our Carter family tribal representatives, the artist cooperative young professionals who'd been quietly frustrated with Millbrook's limited opportunities, and progressive seniors, who understood that preserving community values sometimes required embracing significant change. The Alliance's first formal meeting took place in the back room of Carter's General Store, with folding chairs arranged in a circle that brought together Mary Crow Feather and Robert Crow Feather representing the Tribal Council. Maria Santos coordinating the artist cooperative, Sarah Williams speaking for young families, and Helen Martinez organizing support among longtime residents who'd decided that collaboration was preferable to continued economic decline. The diversity of perspectives in that room created an energy that none of our previous planning sessions had generated, as people who'd lived parallel lives in the same community finally found common ground in shared hopes for Millbrook's future. Victoria's emergence as a natural leader during these coalition meetings surprised everyone, including herself, but her ability to coordinate between different groups and translate competing priorities into workable compromises proved essential to maintaining momentum as our alliance grew more complex. She took charge of organizing cultural exchange programs that would demonstrate the partnership's potential before the community center's physical renovation was complete, coordinating weekend workshops where tribal elders taught traditional crafts while local artisans shared contemporary techniques with tribal youth. "I never realized I was good at bringing people together," Victoria told me after successfully mediating a disagreement between the artist cooperative and tribal representatives about shared gallery space. "But it turns out that managing different personalities and competing interests is just a larger version of what I've been doing with store customers for years. People want to feel heard and respected whether they're buying groceries or planning community events." Dan's teacher instincts for curriculum development and group facilitation translated perfectly to the community education programming that would be central to our community center's success. He began working with tribal educators to design workshops that would serve both cultural preservation and practical skill-building goals, creating programs where participants could learn traditional food preservation techniques alongside modern nutrition science, or explore historical land management practices while studying contemporary environmental challenges. The educational partnerships Dan developed exceeded anything I'd imagined when we first conceived the Community Center project. His collaboration with tribal educators produced a series of intergenerational workshops that attracted participants from 3 surrounding counties, generating interest and support that extended far beyond Millbrook's borders while creating revenue streams that would help sustain our operations long-term. Margaret's transformation from worried family member into unofficial project manager demonstrated organizational skills that years of keeping a struggling family business operational had developed but never fully utilized. She created systems for tracking grant requirements, coordinating volunteer schedules, managing communications between different alliance groups, and ensuring that all the moving parts of our increasingly complex project remained synchronized, despite involving dozens of people with varying levels of experience in community organizing. Her project management capabilities proved particularly valuable as we navigated the bureaucratic requirements for grant compliance, tribal partnership agreements, and local government approvals that threatened to overwhelm volunteers who had day jobs and family responsibilities alongside their commitment to our community center vision. Margaret's ability to break complex processes into manageable tasks and keep everyone informed about deadlines and requirements became the invisible foundation that allowed more visible leadership to succeed. Richard's embrace of his role as historical consultant represented the most significant personal transformation within our family coalition. His initial resistance to change evolved into passionate advocacy for documenting the stories and relationships that had shaped Millbrook's development, as he recognized that understanding the past accurately was essential for building a better future. He began conducting interviews with longtime residents, recording oral histories that revealed connections between families and communities that official records had overlooked or deliberately omitted. The historical documentation project that Richard coordinated became one of our most successful early initiatives, attracting attention from the County Historical Society and state archives while demonstrating the kind of cultural preservation work that grant committees valued highly. His interviews uncovered stories about cooperation between different ethnic and cultural groups that had been forgotten or minimized in conventional town histories, providing evidence that Millbrook's identity had always been more diverse and collaborative than current residents realized. Local media coverage began shifting in our favor as human interest stories emerged about the partnerships and personal transformations our project was generating. The regional newspaper ran a feature story about Victoria's cultural exchange workshops that emphasized the innovative approach to rural community development our alliance represented, while the county radio station began broadcasting interviews with participants in Richard's oral history project. The positive media attention helped counter earlier skeptical coverage and generated interest from other rural communities facing similar economic challenges. Inquiries began arriving from towns throughout Illinois and neighboring states asking for information about our partnership model and requesting visits from our coalition members who could share strategies for building similar collaborative initiatives. Our first major test came with the cultural fair that Victoria organized for late October, designed to demonstrate the community center concept's potential while the renovation work was still months from completion. The event transformed Carter's General Store and the adjacent empty buildings into temporary exhibition and performance spaces with tribal dancers sharing programs with local musicians. Traditional craft demonstrations, alongside contemporary art displays, and food vendors offering both family recipes and innovative fusion cuisines that celebrated multiple cultural traditions. The cultural fair attracted over 800 visitors from a 5-county area, generating local economic impact that exceeded our most optimistic projections while demonstrating community interest that impressed even skeptics who'd questioned whether our collaborative approach could attract significant participation. Local businesses reported their best weekend sales in years, while the positive atmosphere and successful logistics convinced many previously undecided residents that our community center vision was both practical and beneficial. The cultural fair's success gave us momentum we desperately needed, but it also caught Megamart's attention in a way that would test our resolve more than ever. The success of our cultural fair had barely settled into local memory when Megamart's corporate response arrived with the calculated precision of a company that had faced community resistance many times before and developed systematic approaches for overcoming it. Within a week of our successful event, professionally designed flyers began appearing in mailboxes throughout Millbrook, warning residents about the hidden costs and risks associated with what the materials characterized as an experimental community center project that would burden taxpayers while providing uncertain benefits to local economic development. The corporate campaign against our project was more sophisticated and damaging than anything I'd anticipated, combining legitimate concerns about municipal finances with carefully crafted messages designed to exploit existing anxieties about cultural change and outside interference. The flyers claimed that our community center would require ongoing municipal subsidies that would force property tax increases, while simultaneously arguing that the tribal partnership represented a threat to local sovereignty that could lead to complicated legal disputes about land use and zoning authority. Megamart's regional development director, a polished professional named Kenneth Walsh, who'd managed similar campaigns in rural communities across the Midwest, began making appearances at local business association meetings and civic group gatherings presenting detailed financial projections that painted our project as economically irresponsible compared to the job creation and tax revenue that Megamart's expansion would guarantee. His presentations included charts and graphs that looked impressively official while containing assumptions and projections that I recognized as misleading, but that appeared authoritative to audiences without extensive business analysis experience. The corporate representatives proved particularly effective at spreading rumors about the tribal partnership's motives and our project's financial viability that played on existing prejudices and fears within segments of the community that had never been comfortable with collaborative approaches to economic development. They suggested that tribal involvement might lead to gambling operations or tax disputes, while questioning whether grant funding was reliable enough to support the long-term sustainability that responsible community development required. The pressure campaign's effectiveness became apparent as several alliance members began wavering in their support, particularly local business owners who'd been enthusiastic about our project but became concerned about potential backlash from customers who opposed the tribal partnership or feared economic disruption. Mike Johnson from the hardware store was the first to formally withdraw his support, explaining that he couldn't risk alienating customers who viewed our community center as competition for economic development resources that Megamart's expansion would provide more reliably. "I still think your community center idea has merit," Mike told me during an uncomfortable conversation in his store while other customers listened to our discussion. "But I have to be realistic about my own business survival. If half my customers think I'm supporting a project that's going to raise their taxes or create complications with property rights, then I can't afford to be publicly associated with your alliance." The anonymous letters that began appearing in local businesses and being slipped under residential doors represented a more personal and vicious attack on our project's leadership that crossed lines between legitimate political disagreement and character assassination. The letters questioned my motives for returning to Millbrook, suggesting that I was using the community center project to advance my own career, while planning to abandon the community once I'd gained whatever professional benefits my involvement might provide. Victoria received even harsher treatment in the anonymous correspondence with letters that questioned her competence and suggested that her leadership role in cultural exchange programming was evidence of naive idealism that would collapse under the pressure of real-world business challenges. The personal attacks on Victoria were particularly cruel because they targeted insecurities about her educational background and business experience that she'd been working hard to overcome through her successful coordination of alliance activities. Jake's final ultimatum came during what was supposed to be a romantic dinner celebrating Victoria's success with the cultural fair, but instead became an emotional confrontation that forced her to choose between personal happiness and family loyalty in ways that seemed deliberately timed to coincide with the corporate pressure campaign against our project. "I can't keep watching you sacrifice your life for a project that's probably going to fail anyway," Jake said, his voice carrying the kind of frustrated finality that meant he'd already made his decision, regardless of how Victoria responded. "The job in Kansas City is real, the salary is guaranteed, and we could start building an actual future together instead of chasing dreams that might not work out." His ultimatum included a specific deadline that would force Victoria to abandon our community center project just as we were approaching the grant application deadline, and I couldn't help but wonder whether the timing was coincidental or whether Jake had been influenced by the same corporate messaging that was affecting other alliance members' commitment to our collaborative vision. Dan faced similar pressure from his Chicago contacts who questioned his career decisions with the kind of professional concern that sounded supportive, but carried implicit criticism about throwing away advancement opportunities for uncertain rural development projects. His former department head called twice during the week following our cultural fair, ostensibly to check on his family situation, but actually to emphasize how difficult it would be to find comparable teaching positions if he decided to remain in Millbrook permanently. "I understand you're helping your wife's family through a crisis," his colleague said during a conversation that Dan shared with me afterward, "but you need to think about your own professional future and whether this small-town project is worth sacrificing the career advancement opportunities you've worked so hard to earn." The grant deadline pressure intensified all these external challenges because we were still lacking several final approvals and facing a funding gap that could disqualify us from consideration despite the progress we'd made in building community support. The state requires comprehensive documentation of local financial commitments and regulatory approvals before releasing grant funds, and our timeline for completing these requirements was being compressed by the corporate pressure campaign that was making some previously supportive local officials hesitant to provide the endorsements we needed. The morning I found our store windows covered with graffiti saying, "Go back where you came from," I realized we weren't just fighting for a business anymore, we were fighting for the soul of our community. The graffiti on our store windows became a turning point that crystallized the personal choices each of us had been avoiding, forcing decisions that would define not just our project's future, but our own character in ways that couldn't be postponed any longer. Victoria's response to the vandalism and Jake's simultaneous ultimatum revealed a strength and clarity that surprised everyone who'd watched her struggle with divided loyalties for months. "I'm staying," Victoria announced at an emergency family meeting the morning after we'd spent hours scrubbing hate-filled messages from our storefront windows. "Jake gave me until tonight to choose him in Kansas City, but I already know my answer. This community, this project, this family, they're worth fighting for even if it means losing someone I love." Her decision was devastating and empowering, simultaneously marking the end of a relationship she'd hoped would lead to marriage and children, while simultaneously liberating her from the constant pressure to justify her commitment to Millbrook. The tears she shed were genuine grief for a future she was choosing to abandon, but her voice carried conviction that demonstrated how much her leadership role in our alliance had transformed her understanding of her own capabilities and priorities. I spent 2 years trying to become the person Jake wanted me to be. She continued, her confidence growing as she spoke about choices that had seemed impossible just days earlier. But working on this project, coordinating the cultural exchanges, bringing different groups together, I've discovered I'm actually good at things I never thought I could do. I don't want to give it up that version of myself to move somewhere else and start over as someone smaller. Dan's decision to officially decline the Chicago teaching position came the following day, delivered through a phone call that burned bridges. I knew he'd spent years building while opening possibilities neither of us had fully imagined when we first committed to the community center project. His conversation with the school district's human resources director was professional but final, ending with his resignation from a career path that had defined his professional identity for over a decade. "I keep thinking about what we're building here," Dan told me as we walked through downtown Millbrook after he'd made the call that would change our lives permanently. The education partnerships with the tribal council, the intergenerational programming, the way people who'd never talked to each other before are now collaborating on projects that matter. I can't walk away from that kind of meaningful work to return to standardized curriculum requirements and administrative bureaucracy. His commitment to remaining in Millbrook represented more than career sacrifice. It was a philosophical choice about what kind of impact he wanted his professional life to have on the communities he served. The teaching opportunities he was developing through our community center partnership offered intellectual challenges and personal fulfillment that his urban teaching position had never provided, despite the financial security and advancement potential he was abandoning. The marriage issues that had been simmering beneath the surface of Margaret and Richard's relationship throughout our project's stressful months finally came to a head in a series of difficult conversations that either could have destroyed their 40-year partnership or strengthened it in ways that adversity sometimes makes possible. Their breakthrough came when they stopped blaming each other for problems that neither had created individually and started recognizing contributions that stress had made difficult to acknowledge. "I never appreciated how much you've been carrying alone," Richard admitted to Margaret during a conversation I overheard while helping with inventory management. "The bookkeeping, the customer service, the scheduling, the worry about everything that could go wrong. I've been so focused on the physical aspects of running the store that I didn't see how much emotional labor you've been managing." Margaret's response revealed resentments that had been building for years, but also recognition of strengths in Richard that the crisis had highlighted. "And I never understood how much the store means to you as more than just business," she replied. "Watching you interview people for the oral history project, seeing how much you know about families and connections that go back generations, I realize you've been the keeper of community relationships in ways I never fully appreciated." Their renewed respect for each other's contributions became one of the project's unexpected benefits, demonstrating how shared challenges can strengthen partnerships when people choose collaboration over blame. My own personal costs became apparent through phone calls and emails from former Chicago colleagues who viewed my career choices with a mixture of concern and incomprehension that felt like professional isolation. Jennifer Brennan's final communication was particularly harsh, expressing disappointment that bordered on betrayal about my decision to permanently abandon what she characterized as significant advancement opportunities for what she saw as small-town nostalgia. "You're committing career suicide for a project that probably won't work," she said during our last conversation, her voice carrying the cold finality of someone who'd invested professional capital in my success and felt personally betrayed by my choices. "Rural development initiatives fail more often than they succeed, and you'll have no relevant experience to offer serious employers when this community center experiment collapses." The professional bridges I was burning felt real and frightening, but they were overshadowed by the remarkable changes in Grandpa Joe's health and spirits that seemed directly connected to witnessing our family's unity and the community's engagement with his vision. His recovery exceeded all medical expectations, as Dr. Patterson acknowledged during visits that became celebrations rather than crisis management sessions. "I've never seen cardiac recovery like this in someone his age," Dr. Patterson told our assembled family during Grandpa Joe's latest evaluation. "His vital signs have improved dramatically. His energy is returning and his cognitive function is sharper than it's been since before his stroke. I think seeing his dreams becoming reality is providing healing that medications alone couldn't achieve." Several key community members who'd initially opposed our project began publicly switching their support after witnessing the personal sacrifices our family was making, recognizing that our commitment went beyond professional advancement or financial benefit. Jim Patterson's change of heart was particularly significant because his influence among farmers and traditional families carried weight that our alliance had been unable to access through other outreach efforts. "I've been watching the Carter family put everything on the line for this community center project," Jim announced during a town council meeting that drew standing room-only crowds. "When people are willing to sacrifice their personal security for something they believe will help everyone else, that tells me their motives are genuine, and their project deserves our support." The national attention our project began receiving came through academic and policy networks that recognized our tribal partnership and collaborative approach as innovative models for rural community development and cultural reconciliation that could be replicated in other regions facing similar economic and social challenges. Articles in rural development journals and invitations to speak at conferences provided external validation that strengthened local support while creating professional opportunities that partially offset the career advancement I'd abandoned in Chicago. With just 1 month left until the grant deadline, we had community support and family unity, but we still needed a miracle to make the numbers work. The miracle we needed to make the numbers work remained stubbornly absent as we entered the final month before the grant application deadline, despite community support that exceeded our most optimistic projections and family unity that had been forged through months of shared sacrifice and mutual respect. The state's requirements for demonstrating local financial commitment meant we needed to raise matching funds that would prove community investment in our project's success. And despite our alliance's fundraising efforts throughout the fall, we remained $50,000 short of the goal that would qualify us for consideration. The mathematics of our situation were unforgiving in ways that no amount of goodwill or volunteer enthusiasm could overcome. Grant requirements demanded concrete evidence of financial sustainability through documented commitments from local sources, and our combination of individual donations, small business sponsorships, and fundraising events had fallen short of the threshold that state reviewers use to evaluate project viability. Every dollar we'd managed to raise represented genuine sacrifice from families and businesses that were themselves struggling with economic pressures, making our shortfall even more frustrating because it reflected resource limitations rather than lack of support. The final community vote, scheduled for the first Tuesday in December, would determine whether Millbrook officially endorsed our community center project and committed municipal resources to supporting its implementation. But the outcome remained uncertain despite months of relationship building and successful demonstration events. Town council procedures required a simple majority vote among registered residents, and our informal polling suggested we had support from approximately 60% of likely voters, a margin that felt simultaneously encouraging and terrifyingly narrow, given everything that depended on the results. Megamart's last-minute tactical maneuver arrived exactly 2 weeks before the community vote, delivered through personalized job offers that targeted key volunteers who'd been essential to our project's momentum throughout the fall campaign. The corporate strategy was sophisticated and demoralizing, offering immediate employment with benefits and advancement opportunities to people whose skills and leadership had made them valuable to our community. Organizing efforts, but whose economic circumstances made job security impossible to ignore. Maria Santos received an offer to manage the pharmacy section of Megamart's expanded store, with a salary that was nearly double what her beauty salon generated during good months and health insurance benefits that her small business couldn't provide. Several members of the artist cooperative were offered positions in the store's new crafts and home goods section, with the promise of stable income that would allow them to pursue creative work as a hobby, rather than a financially precarious primary occupation. The temptation represented by Megamart's job offers wasn't just financial, but psychological, offering relief from the uncertainty and risk that characterized our community center project compared to the security that corporate employment would provide. Some of our most committed volunteers began expressing doubts about whether they could afford to continue supporting a venture that might fail when guaranteed employment was available for those willing to abandon their collaborative commitments. "I believe in what we're trying to accomplish," Maria told me during a conversation that was clearly painful for both of us. "But I have children to support and a mortgage to pay, and this job offer would solve financial problems that I've been struggling with for years. I don't know if I can choose idealism over security when my family's welfare is at stake." Our own family faced a moment of crushing doubt when Mike Rodriguez discovered additional structural problems that would require immediate attention before any renovation work could proceed safely. The building's foundation showed more extensive settling than his original assessment had detected, requiring reinforcement work that would add $30,000 to construction costs that were already straining our available resources. "I wish I had better news," Mike explained as he showed us engineering reports that documented problems he'd hoped wouldn't require immediate correction. But these foundation issues can't be ignored without risking structural failure that would endanger anyone using the building. The work has to be done before any other renovation can proceed, and it has to be done right the first time. The additional costs threaten to consume our entire contingency fund, while still leaving us short of the matching funds required for grant qualification, creating a financial crisis that forced us to confront the possibility that our community center dreams might be mathematically impossible, regardless of how much community support we managed to generate. Victoria's response to these mounting challenges demonstrated leadership growth that transformed her from someone who'd been overwhelmed by responsibilities into someone who could inspire others to overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. She organized a youth campaign that reached every household in Millbrook, with personal appeals from teenagers and young adults who explained why the community center mattered to their generation's future in ways that abstract economic arguments couldn't convey. "We're not asking for handouts," Victoria coached the young volunteers who went door to door throughout the town during the weeks leading up to the vote. "We're asking people to invest in creating opportunities for us to build lives here instead of having to leave everything we love to find careers elsewhere. This project is about proving that small towns can adapt and thrive without losing what makes them special." The youth campaign generated emotional responses that surprised longtime residents who'd never heard local teenagers articulate their hopes and frustrations with such clarity and passion. Parents who'd assumed their children would inevitably leave Millbrook after high school began reconsidering whether the community center might create reasons for young people to stay and contribute to the town's future, rather than viewing it as a place to escape from. Helen Martinez coordinated a parallel outreach effort among senior citizens, organizing a phone tree that connected elderly residents who shared memories of what community cooperation had meant to Millbrook during previous generations' challenges. The Senior Citizen Campaign emphasized historical precedents for neighbors working together to overcome economic hardship and build institutions that served multiple generations simultaneously. During the Depression, people in this town pulled together to keep the school open and the church maintained and families fed. Helen reminded callers who'd lived through or heard stories about earlier periods when community survival had required collective action. "This community center represents the same kind of shared investment in our future that helped Millbrook survive hard times before." The phone tree conversations revealed stories about barn raisings, community gardens, shared equipment cooperatives, and mutual aid networks that had sustained rural communities during previous economic transitions, providing historical context that helped current residents understand our project as part of Millbrook's tradition of cooperative problem-solving rather than a departure from local values. The night before the community vote, I stood in Grandpa Joe's hospital room, looking out at the town lights, knowing that tomorrow would either vindicate everything we'd sacrificed or prove that some dreams are too big for small towns to achieve. The morning of December 1st dawned crisp and clear with the kind of brilliant winter sunshine that seemed designed to illuminate decisions of consequence, and by 7 a.m., when the community center at the Methodist Church opened its doors for voting, cars were already lining Main Street in numbers I hadn't seen since the county fair. The record turnout that followed exceeded even our most optimistic projections, transforming what could have been a routine municipal election into something that felt like a celebration of democratic participation itself. 3 generations of families arrived together throughout the day, grandparents walking slowly beside parents pushing strollers, creating scenes that demonstrated how deeply our community center debate had penetrated every level of Millbrook society. The Hendersons brought 4 generations to vote together, from 87-year-old patriarch Ernest to his great-granddaughter Sarah's 6-month-old baby, turning their trip to the polling station into a family photo opportunity that captured the multi-generational stakes of the decision we were all making. The atmosphere outside the community center buzzed with the kind of energy that accompanies moments when entire communities recognize they're participating in decisions that will define their collective future. Neighbors who hadn't spoken in months found themselves discussing the implications of the vote, while children who'd accompanied their parents seemed to sense the importance of the day through the serious attention adults were paying to conversations that usually happened behind closed doors. Megamart's representatives made their final appeals throughout the morning, positioning themselves strategically near the voting entrance with professionally prepared materials that emphasized economic benefits and job security in language designed to resonate with families facing financial pressures. Kenneth Walsh personally handed out flyers that contrasted guaranteed employment opportunities with what he characterized as the risky uncertainties of an experimental community center project that might consume tax dollars without delivering promised results. You have a choice between proven economic development that will benefit every family in Millbrook and a speculative venture that asks you to gamble your community's future on untested ideas. Walsh told voters with the polished confidence of someone who'd delivered similar messages in dozens of rural communities. Megamart's expansion will create 40 permanent jobs with benefits and career advancement opportunities that your young people need to build lives here instead of moving away. The community center supporters who'd gathered near the church entrance offered a different vision, emphasizing local ownership and collaborative decision-making that would keep economic development under community control rather than corporate management. Victoria had positioned herself where she could greet voters personally, and her passionate advocacy for young people's right to have reasons for staying in their hometown proved more compelling than I'd dared hope. We're not asking you to choose between economic development and community values. Victoria told groups of voters throughout the day, her voice carrying conviction that months of leadership experience had developed. We're asking you to choose economic development that reflects our values and serves our priorities instead of someone else's profit margins. The community center will create jobs too, but they'll be jobs that belong to us and serve our neighbors. Dan's presentation about the education benefits that our community center would provide for local children drew particularly strong responses from parents who'd been struggling with limited resources for after-school programs, summer activities, and cultural enrichment that their children needed but couldn't access within Millbrook's current infrastructure. His teacher's ability to translate abstract programming concepts into specific benefits that families could envision made the community center's educational mission tangible in ways that architectural plans and grant applications couldn't achieve. Your children deserve opportunities to learn about their community's history, develop creative talents, and gain skills that will prepare them for success, whether they choose to stay in Millbrook or pursue opportunities elsewhere. Dan explained to groups of parents who'd brought their children to witness the democratic process. The community center's educational partnerships will provide resources that no single family could afford individually, but that all our children can access when we work together. Richard's decision to speak publicly in defense of our project surprised everyone, including family members who'd watched him struggle with the changes our community center would bring to traditions he'd always cherished. His eloquent defense of change while honoring tradition demonstrated wisdom that came from months of interviewing longtime residents and documenting the ways Millbrook had successfully adapted to challenges throughout previous generations. "Change isn't the enemy of tradition," Richard told the crowd that had gathered to hear final arguments before voting concluded. "Sometimes change is how we preserve what matters most about our community while adapting to circumstances that require new approaches. Our family store has served this town for 4 generations, not because it never changed, but because each generation found ways to serve the community's needs as those needs evolved." His speech connecting our community center project to Millbrook's history of cooperative problem-solving provided exactly the kind of historical context that helped undecided voters understand our proposal as continuous with local values rather than a departure from them. The respect that longtime residents had always shown for Richard's practical wisdom translated into serious consideration of arguments they might have dismissed from younger, less established community members. The vote counting that began at 8 p.m. proceeded with painstaking transparency that reflected the community's understanding of how much depended on accurate results with representatives from both sides, observing every step of the process, while tension built among crowds who'd gathered in the church fellowship hall to await results. When the final tallies were announced at nearly 10 p.m., our community center project had won by the narrowest margin possible, while still providing a clear mandate for proceeding. 52% of Millbrook residents had voted to support the community center project, while 48% had chosen Megamart's expansion proposal results that provided victory while highlighting how divided our community remained about the best path forward. The celebration that followed our announcement was genuine but subdued, tempered by recognition that nearly half our neighbors had preferred a different vision for Millbrook's future and would need to be convinced through successful implementation rather than campaign rhetoric. Victoria's tears of relief and gratitude were matched by similar emotional responses from Alliance members who'd invested months of intensive effort in building support for collaborative economic development. But the disappointed faces scattered throughout the crowd served as reminders that winning a vote was different from winning hearts and minds. We'd won the vote, but as I saw the disappointed faces of nearly half our neighbors, I realized the real challenge of building community unity was just beginning. The narrow victory margin that had given us permission to proceed with construction became irrelevant once actual renovation work began, as the daily reality of collaborative labor demonstrated the community center's potential more effectively than any campaign speech or promotional material could have achieved. The first morning that volunteer crews gathered outside Carter's General Store at 7 a.m., I expected to see primarily our established Alliance members, but the group that assembled included several faces that had been notably absent from our campaign events, and at least 3 people who'd voted against the project, but apparently decided to judge our efforts by results rather than rhetoric. The volunteer labor force that emerged represented an unexpected cross-section of Millbrook's population, combining project supporters with tribal partners who brought construction skills and traditional building techniques that complemented conventional renovation approaches. Robert Crowfeather coordinated tribal volunteers who contributed expertise in sustainable materials and energy-efficient construction methods that reduced costs while demonstrating environmental stewardship principles that appealed to community members who'd been skeptical about other aspects of our cultural partnership. Former opponents who joined the construction efforts after witnessing our inclusive and respectful approach to managing diverse volunteer crews provided some of the most encouraging evidence that community divisions could heal through shared work toward common goals. Jim Patterson surprised everyone by volunteering his weekends to help with foundation reinforcement work, explaining that he wanted to see for himself whether our project management was as professional and competent as we'd claimed during the campaign. "I voted against this project because I thought it was unrealistic," Jim admitted during a lunch break that brought together volunteers from different backgrounds and political perspectives. "But watching how you coordinate between professional contractors and community volunteers, how you handle safety requirements and quality control, I'm starting to think maybe you folks know what you're doing after all." My role coordinating professional contractors with community volunteers required project management skills I'd never developed in my corporate marketing career. forcing rapid learning about construction timelines, building codes, safety protocols, and quality control standards that determined whether our renovation would succeed or create expensive problems that could undermine the entire community center concept. The coordination challenges were complicated by the need to respect both professional standards and volunteer enthusiasm while maintaining insurance coverage and regulatory compliance that grant requirements demanded. The hands-on project management experience proved invaluable for understanding the practical realities of community development in ways that business school training and corporate consulting had never addressed. Learning to manage construction schedules around volunteers' work commitments and family obligations, while ensuring professional contractors could complete specialized tasks efficiently, required diplomatic skills and logistical creativity that translated into broader leadership capabilities. Victoria's development of unexpected skills in cultural programming and youth outreach represented one of the construction period's most significant personal transformations, as she discovered talents for event coordination and cross-cultural communication that had been hidden beneath years of routine retail work. Her collaboration with tribal educators to design workshops that would operate in renovated spaces created programming models that attracted attention from cultural organizations throughout the region. The youth outreach initiatives that Victoria coordinated during construction demonstrated immediate benefits that helped convert remaining skeptics who could see tangible results from our collaborative approach. Teenagers from both tribal and non-tribal backgrounds worked together on construction projects while participating in educational programs that combined practical skill development with cultural exchange, creating exactly the kind of intergenerational learning opportunities that Grandpa Joe's original vision had emphasized. Dan's creation of educational components that served the local school district while building community capacity established formal partnerships that strengthened our grant compliance while demonstrating sustainable revenue streams that addressed financial sustainability concerns. His development of after-school programs that operated in partially completed community center spaces provided immediate service delivery that proved our concept's viability before renovation work was finished. The educational programming that Dan implemented during construction included homework assistance, college preparation workshops, and career exploration sessions that connected local students with tribal professionals, artists, and community leaders who could provide mentorship and guidance that wasn't available through traditional school resources. These programs generated enthusiastic participation from families who'd been uncertain about community center benefits, but could observe direct improvements in their children's educational experiences. Margaret's management of daily operations during the construction period required balancing traditional store functions with community center development activities, coordinator volunteer schedules, and managing communications between different groups involved in renovation work. Her organizational skills proved essential for maintaining the complex logistics that allowed construction to proceed efficiently while keeping existing retail operations functional enough to generate revenue that supported family expenses during the transition period. Richard's documentation of the construction process for historical record created an invaluable archive that captured both the practical challenges and the community cooperation that characterized our renovation work. His interviews with volunteers, contractors, and community members provided perspectives on collaborative economic development that could inform similar projects in other rural communities while preserving stories about Millbrook's adaptation to changing economic circumstances. Grandpa Joe's return from the hospital to limited involvement in community center development provided emotional highlights that motivated volunteers and demonstrated the personal significance of seeing dreams become reality, despite health challenges and family crises. His presence during construction work days, even when limited to supervisory roles and consultation about design decisions, connected current efforts to the vision and values that had inspired our entire project. His joy at witnessing the transformation of his general store into a community center that exceeded even his ambitious dreams provided daily reminders of why our collaboration mattered beyond immediate economic benefits. The respect that volunteer workers showed for his historical perspective and practical wisdom created intergenerational connections that enriched the construction experience while honoring the legacy that had made our project possible. Construction challenges that arose throughout the renovation period consistently brought people together as community problem-solving became the norm rather than the exception, with volunteers from different backgrounds contributing diverse skills and perspectives to overcome obstacles that professional contractors alone might have found more difficult to address. The collaborative approach to solving practical problems created relationships and communication patterns that would serve the community center well once programming began operating in completed spaces. 3 months into construction, when the building inspector arrived for final approval, we discovered one critical issue that could stop everything. The critical issue that threatened to stop everything materialized in the form of Inspector Janet Williams, a thorough professional whose attention to detail had saved countless building projects from costly mistakes, but whose findings now presented us with an obstacle that could destroy months of collaborative effort and community investment. Her inspection revealed that our renovation plans, while compliant with most building codes, fell short of current accessibility requirements that had been updated since our original architectural drawings were completed. The Americans with Disabilities Act compliance issues aren't optional, Inspector Williams explained as she walked us through a list of required modifications that included wheelchair-accessible restrooms, ramp installations, wider doorways, and specialized equipment for hearing-impaired visitors. These upgrades weren't included in your original construction permits because the regulations changed after your plans were approved, but they're mandatory for any public facility that receives state funding. The accessibility upgrades she required would cost approximately $25,000 and take at least 6 weeks to complete, properly creating a timeline crisis that threatened our grant funding deadline in ways that no amount of volunteer enthusiasm could overcome. State regulations required final inspection approval before grant funds could be released, and missing the March deadline would mean losing not only the matching funds we'd worked so hard to secure, but also the community investments that families and businesses had contributed throughout our fundraising campaign. The community faced a stark choice that reduced months of collaborative effort to a simple question: abandon the project now and salvage what we could from our investment, or find a way to raise additional funds in just 30 days, while completing construction work that professional contractors estimated would require longer than our available timeline allowed. The emergency community meeting I called for that evening brought together a crowd that was larger and more diverse than any gathering we'd organized throughout our campaign, including people who'd opposed the project initially, but had become invested in its success through witnessing months of collaborative construction work. The challenge I presented to the assembled community was both financial and logistical. We needed to raise $25,000 immediately while organizing volunteer labor that could accelerate construction timelines through round-the-clock work shifts. My proposal for a community-wide fundraising campaign required every person and business in Millbrook to contribute whatever they could manage, recognizing that many families were already stretched financially, but hoping that collective effort could achieve what individual sacrifice couldn't accomplish. The campaign would combine traditional fundraising approaches with innovative community engagement strategies that had emerged from our collaborative construction experience. The most surprising development came when several former opponents stepped forward to organize support that exceeded anything I dared hope for during our most optimistic planning sessions. Jim Patterson, who'd voted against the project but had been won over by witnessing our professional construction management, volunteered to coordinate a benefit dinner that would bring together Megamart supporters and community center advocates in shared fundraising efforts. "I still think Megamart would have been a safer choice economically," Jim announced to the assembled crowd. "But I can't argue with what I've seen over the past 3 months. This project has brought people together in ways I didn't expect. And now that we're this close to completion, I think we owe it to ourselves and our children to see it through." The benefit dinner that Jim's committee organized became the centerpiece of our 30-day fundraising campaign, combining traditional community supper elements with auction items donated by businesses throughout the county and entertainment provided through our tribal partnership. The event planning required coordination between groups that had never worked together before, creating new relationships that strengthened community connections beyond our immediate fundraising needs. Victoria's coordination of youth fundraising activities demonstrated leadership skills that had been developing throughout our construction period. as she organized high school students in car washes, bake sales, and door-to-door campaigns that reached every household in Millbrook, with personal appeals from young people who could articulate why the community center mattered to their generation's future in town. The youth fundraising efforts proved particularly effective because they allowed teenagers to take ownership of advocating for opportunities they would directly benefit from, while also providing older residents with concrete examples of young people who wanted to remain in Millbrook if the community could provide reasons for staying. Victoria's ability to coordinate these activities while maintaining her regular responsibilities showed organizational capabilities that surprised everyone, including herself. Dan's organization of adult volunteer shifts for accelerated construction work created a schedule that allowed renovation to continue around the clock during weekends and evenings, with different crews taking responsibility for specific tasks under professional contractor supervision. The volunteer coordination required managing dozens of schedules while ensuring safety protocols and quality standards were maintained despite the pressure of compressed timelines. The tribal partnership's contribution of traditional food and entertainment for benefit events provided cultural richness that attracted visitors from surrounding communities, while demonstrating the authentic collaboration that had made our community center concept distinctive among rural development projects. Tribal members who contributed their time and expertise to fundraising events did so without expectation of direct benefit, showing generosity that impressed community members who'd been skeptical about the partnership's motives. Mary Crow Feather's coordination of traditional cooking for the benefit dinner required ingredients and preparation time that tribal families donated despite their own economic challenges, creating meals that introduced Millbrook residents to cultural traditions, while raising funds for accessibility improvements that would benefit everyone who used the community center. Helen Martinez's leadership of senior citizens in organizing a handicraft sale represented one of the most touching aspects of our fundraising campaign, as elderly residents contributed handmade quilts, woodworking projects, and preserved foods that represented hours of skilled labor donated to support a vision of community cooperation that resonated with their memories of previous generations' collaborative efforts. The handicraft sale attracted buyers from throughout the region who recognized the quality and cultural significance of items that senior citizens had created, while also providing opportunities for elderly residents to share stories about traditional skills and community history that enriched the cultural programming our community center would eventually offer. The donation of all proceeds to the Accessibility Fund demonstrated the kind of intergenerational investment in community infrastructure that had sustained rural communities through previous economic transitions, while also providing practical evidence that Millbrook residents were willing to make personal sacrifices for collective benefits. With 1 week left until deadline, we were still $15,000 short when an unexpected visitor arrived with an offer that seemed too good to be true. The unexpected visitor who arrived at our community center construction site that Tuesday morning turned out to be Dr. Sarah Chen, the State Economic Development Officer, whose reputation for identifying innovative rural development projects had made her one of the most influential voices in Illinois community planning circles. Her unannounced visit caught us completely off guard as she appeared during the morning volunteer shift, wearing business attire that looked distinctly out of place among the construction dust and paint-splattered work clothes that had become our standard uniform. "I've been following your project through reports from our grant review committee," Dr. Chen explained, as she observed tribal members working alongside local volunteers to install accessibility ramps that would meet the inspector's requirements. "What I'm seeing here represents exactly the kind of grassroots community cooperation that our department wants to support and replicate throughout rural Illinois." Her offer to designate our community center as a demonstration site for the state's rural development program came with additional matching funds that would not only cover our remaining $15,000 shortfall, but also provide resources for documenting and sharing our collaborative model with other communities facing similar economic challenges. The demonstration site designation would require us to host visits from other rural development teams and participate in research studies, but the financial support would ensure our project's completion while creating opportunities to influence policy at the state level. The national media attention that had been building throughout our fundraising campaign intensified following Dr. Chen's announcement, bringing donations from people across the country who'd been inspired by stories about Millbrook's collaborative approach to community development. News articles about our tribal partnership and intergenerational cooperation attracted readers who saw our project as a positive example of rural communities adapting to economic change through inclusion rather than division. Online fundraising platforms that Victoria had established to reach beyond our local community began receiving contributions from urban professionals who'd grown up in small towns and recognized the challenges we were addressing through our community center model. The donations ranged from $5 contributions accompanied by notes of encouragement to substantial gifts from successful business owners who wanted to support innovation in rural economic development. Former Millbrook residents now living in Chicago, St. Louis, and other metropolitan areas organized their own fundraising efforts to support their hometown's renaissance, creating networks of expatriate support that none of us had anticipated when we began our community center project. These former residents brought resources and connections that amplified our local efforts while also providing evidence that small-town roots could remain meaningful even after people moved to pursue opportunities elsewhere. The most significant external support came from Patricia Hendricks at First National Bank, who contacted me to arrange a meeting that would reconsider their original loan rejection based on the demonstrated community support and external validation our project had generated through months of collaborative effort. Her offer included favorable terms that reflected the bank's recognition that our community center represented a sound investment rather than the risky speculation they'd initially perceived. When we evaluated your original application, we focused primarily on financial projections and market analysis, Patricia explained during our meeting in her office that overlooked Main Street's increasingly busy construction activity. But what we're seeing now is community engagement and external support that fundamentally changes the risk profile of this project. You've proven that there's genuine demand for what you're creating. The bank's willingness to provide construction financing at competitive rates eliminated the immediate financial pressure that had been consuming our attention, while allowing us to focus on completing renovation work within timelines that would meet grant requirements and community expectations. Perhaps the most surprising development came through a phone call from Megamart's corporate headquarters, where public relations officials had been monitoring media coverage of our community center project and decided that sponsoring accessibility improvements would demonstrate corporate social responsibility while addressing criticism about their impact on small-town economies. Their offer to fully fund the accessibility upgrades came without strings attached, representing a significant shift in corporate strategy that acknowledged the value of supporting local community development initiatives. The Megamart sponsorship announcement generated mixed reactions within our alliance, as some members felt uncomfortable accepting support from a corporation whose expansion plans we'd been opposing for months. However, the practical benefits of corporate funding that would ensure project completion while freeing community resources for programming development ultimately convinced most participants that accepting the sponsorship was the right decision. Victoria's reaction to these developments revealed how much her leadership role in bridging different community groups had prepared her for broader opportunities that extended beyond Millbrook's boundaries. Her confidence in negotiating with state officials, corporate representatives, and media contacts demonstrated skills that had been developing throughout our community center project, but were only now becoming fully apparent. I never imagined I could coordinate between this many different organizations and interests, Victoria told me as we reviewed agreements and commitments that would secure our project's completion. But everything I learned from bringing together tribal representatives, local businesses, volunteer groups, and family members taught me how to find common ground between people who start with different priorities. Her recognition that the community organizing experience had prepared her for leadership roles beyond Millbrook represented personal growth that exceeded anything our original project vision had anticipated, while also suggesting possibilities for her future contributions to rural development efforts throughout the region. Project completion became certain as funding was secured from multiple sources, and timelines became achievable through the combination of professional contractors, volunteer labor, and external support that had emerged from genuine community engagement rather than top-down planning or corporate management. The accessibility improvements that had threatened to derail our entire effort were now fully funded, while additional resources would support programming development and operational sustainability that addressed long-term success rather than just immediate completion. The final fundraising celebration that we organized to thank everyone who'd contributed to our community center's success brought together the largest and most diverse crowd in Millbrook's recent history, with visitors from throughout the region joining local residents for an evening that combined traditional community supper elements with cultural performances and recognition of the collaborative effort that had made our project possible. As I stood watching tribal dancers perform at our final fundraising celebration, I realized we hadn't just saved a building, we'd transformed what it means to be a community. The transformation we'd witnessed throughout months of collaborative construction work reached its culmination on a perfect May morning, when Carter Community Center opened its doors to visitors who'd traveled from across Illinois and neighboring states to witness what Dr. Chen had described as the most successful grassroots rural development model in recent memory. The grand opening drew over 1,200 people to downtown Millbrook, creating the kind of bustling activity that Main Street hadn't experienced since the county fair moved to a larger venue 15 years earlier. The Carter Community Center that welcomed these visitors represented a complete transformation of our original general store concept, combining renovated retail space with components that none of us had imagined when Grandpa Joe first shared his architectural plans. The main floor showcased local artisan products and regionally sourced goods alongside a tribal cultural exhibit that featured rotating displays of traditional crafts, historical artifacts, and educational materials that had attracted attention from museums throughout the Midwest. Artist studios occupied the renovated second floor where visitors could observe painters, sculptors, and traditional craftspeople working on projects while also purchasing completed pieces that reflected both contemporary creativity and cultural preservation. The flexible meeting spaces that Dan had designed could accommodate everything from town council sessions to wedding receptions, while the business incubator section provided affordable workspace for entrepreneurs who were testing retail concepts or developing service businesses that served the broader region. Victoria's role cutting the ceremonial ribbon took on additional significance when she was introduced as the newly elected president of the Millbrook Young Professionals Association, an organization that hadn't existed before our community center project, but had emerged organically from relationships formed during construction and programming development. Her election by unanimous vote of the association's 37 charter members demonstrated how much respect she'd earned through her leadership in coordinating cultural exchanges and youth outreach initiatives. 6 months ago, I thought my only choices were staying in Millbrook without opportunities for growth, or leaving to find career advancement somewhere else, Victoria told the assembled crowd during her ribbon-cutting speech. This community center represents a third option that I never imagined, creating opportunities here that are as challenging and meaningful as anything I could have found by moving away. Her confidence and articulation impressed visitors who represented potential funding sources and partnership opportunities for rural development initiatives, while also providing inspiration for other young professionals who'd been struggling with similar choices about whether small-town life could accommodate career ambitions and personal growth. Dan's announcement of a new community college program developed in partnership with tribal education initiatives generated enthusiastic responses from educators and policymakers who recognized the innovative approach to combining cultural preservation with practical skill development. The program would offer certificates in sustainable agriculture, traditional crafts, and community organizing, while also providing college credit that students could transfer to four-year institutions. We're creating educational pathways that honor traditional knowledge while preparing students for modern economic opportunities, Dan explained to reporters who'd come to document our opening day success. Students can learn both historical land management practices and contemporary environmental science, both traditional craft techniques and modern marketing strategies for selling handmade goods online. The educational programming that Dan had developed exceeded anything I'd envisioned when we first discussed his role in our community center project. demonstrating how collaborative relationships could generate innovations that none of us could have conceived individually. Richard and Margaret's transformation into official center historians and volunteer coordinators represented personal growth that paralleled our community's development, as they discovered talents for public speaking and educational programming that had been hidden beneath decades of routine retail work. Their welcoming of visitors included guided tours that combined historical information about Millbrook's development with explanations of how our community center model addressed contemporary rural challenges. The oral history project that Richard had coordinated during construction had evolved into a multimedia presentation that used recorded interviews, historical photographs, and artifacts to tell stories about cooperation between different cultural groups that official town histories had overlooked or minimized. Margaret's coordination of volunteer schedules and visitor services demonstrated organizational capabilities that impressed professional community development specialists who'd come to study our collaborative model. Grandpa Joe's presence at the grand opening provided emotional highlights that connected our current success to the vision and persistence that had made our project possible, despite health crises and family conflicts that could have derailed our efforts entirely. His recovery had exceeded all medical expectations, and his participation in welcoming visitors and sharing his vision for the center's future impact demonstrated the healing power of seeing dreams become reality through community collaboration. This building represents more than successful business development, Grandpa Joe told the crowd during his blessing of the community center. It represents proof that small communities can adapt to changing economic conditions without losing the values and relationships that make rural life worth preserving. His words resonated with visitors who represented dozens of rural communities facing similar challenges, many of whom had come specifically to learn strategies they could adapt to their own economic development efforts. Local businesses throughout Millbrook reported increased foot traffic and tourist interest that exceeded their most optimistic projections for economic impact from our community center's cultural programming and visitor attraction. The tribal partnership had generated publicity that brought people from throughout the region who were interested in cultural experiences, educational workshops, and handmade goods that couldn't be found in urban retail environments. Murphy's Diner served more meals during our opening weekend than they typically served during entire months, while other Main Street businesses experienced similar increases in customer activity that demonstrated the multiplier effect of successful community development initiatives on broader local economies. Even former opponents of our project acknowledged its success during the grand opening celebration, though several maintained reservations about the rapid changes our community center had brought to Millbrook's traditional rhythms and social relationships. Jim Patterson's comments to visiting reporters reflected the complex feelings that many longtime residents had developed about our project's impact. "I have to admit they've accomplished more than I thought possible," Jim said during an interview that would be featured in the state's Rural Development newsletter. "The economic benefits are obvious, and the community cooperation has been impressive. I still worry about whether this level of activity and change is sustainable for a town our size, but I can't argue with the results we're seeing." His acknowledgement of our success while maintaining honest concerns about sustainability reflected the kind of thoughtful skepticism that would help our community center avoid the overconfidence that destroys many successful initiatives during their early stages of operation. The grand opening celebration was everything we'd dreamed of, but I knew the real test would come in the quiet months ahead when daily operations would prove whether our vision was sustainable. The sustainable success that had seemed like such an uncertain prospect during our most challenging construction months became undeniable reality 6 months after opening, when Carter Community Center's usage statistics and financial performance exceeded even our most optimistic projections from the original grant application. Monthly visitor counts averaged over 800 people, with programming participation rates that required us to expand workshop schedules and add evening hours to accommodate demand from working families who couldn't attend daytime activities. The financial sustainability that had worried potential supporters throughout our campaign proved remarkably solid, with revenue streams from retail sales, workshop fees, meeting space rentals, and educational programming, generating enough income to cover operational costs while building reserves for equipment replacement and program expansion. The combination of local support, regional tourism, and state demonstration site funding had created a business model that other rural communities were eager to study and potentially replicate. My decision to establish Carter Community Development Consulting as a permanent business, helping other small towns develop similar projects, emerged naturally from the dozens of inquiries we'd received from rural communities throughout Illinois and neighboring states. The consulting work allowed me to remain in Millbrook while applying skills I'd developed through our community center experience to challenges that went far beyond what I'd ever encountered in corporate marketing. The consulting business provided both intellectual stimulation and meaningful impact that my previous career had never offered, as each community presented unique combinations of assets, challenges, and cultural dynamics that required customized approaches to collaborative economic development. Working with communities that were in various stages of rural transition helped me understand how transferable our Millbrook model was, while also recognizing which elements were specific to our particular circumstances and relationships. Victoria's decision to run for town council represented the most significant personal transformation our project had produced, as someone who'd never considered herself politically inclined discovered that her community organizing experience had prepared her perfectly for local government responsibilities. Her campaign platform emphasized intergenerational cooperation and inclusive economic development strategies that reflected lessons learned through our community center project. Her election seemed inevitable given the respect she'd earned through coordinating cultural exchanges and youth programming, but her margin of victory surprised even her supporters. Receiving over 70% of votes cast demonstrated how much her leadership had resonated with residents who appreciated her ability to build bridges between different community groups while maintaining focus on practical results. Dan's hybrid role, teaching part-time at the community college while coordinating educational programming at our community center, had attracted attention from state education officials who were looking for innovative approaches to rural education enhancement. His model of combining traditional classroom instruction with community-based experiential learning was being studied as a potential template for addressing teacher shortages and educational resource limitations that plagued many rural school districts. The recognition Dan's educational approach had received led to speaking engagements at academic conferences and consultation opportunities with other rural education initiatives, providing career advancement that neither of us had imagined when we first committed to remaining in Millbrook permanently. His professional growth demonstrated how rural communities could offer opportunities for innovation and leadership that urban environments couldn't necessarily provide. Margaret and Richard's discovery of new purpose as community center coordinators had strengthened their marriage in ways that surprised family members who'd watched them struggle with stress and disagreement throughout our project's most challenging periods. Their complementary skills in historical documentation and volunteer coordination had made them essential to daily operations, while also providing them with shared goals that reinforced their partnership. Their collaboration on developing historical programming and managing visitor services had created opportunities for travel and professional development that retirement from retail work alone would never have provided, while also allowing them to contribute expertise and experience to community development efforts beyond Millbrook. The tribal partnership that had been controversial during our planning stages had exceeded all expectations for cultural enrichment and economic development, leading to state recognition as a model for cultural preservation and reconciliation initiatives. Additional grants for documenting traditional knowledge and developing educational materials had strengthened tribal participation while creating resources that were being used by schools and cultural organizations throughout the region. Several young families had moved back to Millbrook during the months following our opening, citing community center programs and the collaborative atmosphere our project had created as major factors in their decision to return to rural living. The reverse migration represented exactly the kind of demographic trend that rural development specialists hoped to encourage through initiatives that provided urban amenities within small-town contexts. Perhaps most surprisingly, Megamart and our community center had found ways to coexist, successfully serving different community needs without the destructive competition we'd anticipated during our campaign. The corporate store provided convenience and competitive pricing for everyday necessities, while our community center offered cultural experiences, educational opportunities, and locally produced goods that attracted customers seeking different kinds of value. As I updated Grandpa Joe on our first-year success report, he smiled and said there was one more surprise he'd been saving for the right moment. The surprise that Grandpa Joe had been saving turned out to be a comprehensive documentation project he'd been working on throughout our entire community transformation process, recording not just the practical steps we'd taken, but also the personal stories and relationship changes that had made our collaborative approach successful. His revelation that he'd been systematically photographing, interviewing, and writing about our experience came with the announcement that a regional publisher had expressed interest in turning his materials into a book about grassroots rural development. "I've been getting up early every morning since I came home from the hospital," he explained, showing me boxes of organized materials that included hundreds of photographs, transcribed interviews, and detailed observations about how our community had evolved throughout the project. I wanted to capture not just what we accomplished, but how we accomplished it so other communities could understand the human side of economic development that doesn't show up in grant applications or business plans. The documentation project that Grandpa Joe had been quietly pursuing represented the kind of institutional memory that most rural development initiatives lost when key participants moved away or simply forgot the details of what had made their efforts successful. His systematic approach to preserving our experience would provide other communities with resources that went far beyond the consulting services I'd been offering. Our project's growing reputation as a successful model for collaborative rural development had begun attracting graduate students from universities throughout the Midwest who were studying community organizing, economic development, and cultural preservation as academic specializations. The research partnerships that emerged from these academic relationships brought fresh energy and analytical perspectives to our ongoing programming, while also providing documentation that strengthened our credibility with funding sources and policymakers. The graduate student researchers contributed labor for special projects, while conducting interviews and surveys that helped us understand which aspects of our model were most transferable to other communities, and which elements were specific to Millbrook's particular circumstances and relationships. Their academic frameworks for analyzing our success provided vocabulary and theoretical context that enhanced my ability to explain our approach to potential consulting clients. Victoria's announcement that she'd become engaged to David Crow. Feather, son of tribal council member Robert Crow Feather, represented the most personal symbol of the cultural bridge building that our community center project had achieved. Their relationship had developed through collaborative work on educational programming and cultural events, demonstrating how shared projects could create connections that transcended historical divisions and cultural differences. The engagement announcement generated celebration throughout both tribal and non-tribal communities that had been working together through our alliance, while also providing concrete evidence that our partnership had created lasting relationships, rather than just temporary cooperation for mutual economic benefit. Victoria's integration into tribal cultural activities and David's involvement in town government activities showed how individual relationships could strengthen broader community connections. Dan's opportunity to develop statewide curriculum based on the Millbrook community education model came through his connections with state education officials who'd been monitoring his innovative approach to combining traditional classroom instruction with community-based experiential learning. The curriculum development project would require him to travel throughout Illinois, documenting successful rural education initiatives, while creating materials that other communities could adapt to their specific circumstances and resources. The statewide curriculum project represented exactly the kind of career advancement that Dan had been seeking when we first considered staying in Millbrook, permanently proving that rural communities could provide professional opportunities that matched or exceeded what urban environments offered. His expertise in community education had become recognized at the state level, creating consulting opportunities and speaking engagements that established him as a leader in rural education innovation. My discovery that I was pregnant added personal significance to the community development work that had already transformed our family's life, as the next generation would grow up in the revitalized community that their parents had helped create, rather than inheriting the economic decline and social division that had characterized Millbrook when we first returned. The timing felt symbolic of renewal and continuity that extended beyond immediate project success. The Carter family business expansion to include consulting services for other rural community development projects formalized the expertise we'd gained through our own transformation while creating revenue streams that would support our family's long-term commitment to remaining in Millbrook. The consulting work provided variety and intellectual challenge while allowing us to contribute to rural development efforts that extended far beyond our immediate community. National Foundation representatives who approached us about replicating the Millbrook model in other small towns facing similar economic and demographic challenges brought resources and credibility that could accelerate rural development efforts throughout regions that had been struggling with decline for decades. The Foundation partnership would provide funding for documentation and replication, while also connecting us with policymakers and academic researchers who could amplify our impact. The community center's emergence as a case study taught in universities across the country represented recognition that our collaborative approach had academic as well as practical significance, influencing how future community development professionals understood the relationship between cultural preservation, economic development, and social cohesion in rural contexts. When the documentary crew arrived to film our story, I realized we'd accomplished something even bigger than saving one family business. The documentary filming that had captured national attention for our community transformation story became the catalyst for a ripple effect that extended far beyond what any of us had imagined when we first committed to saving Carter's General Store. Within 18 months of the documentary's release, 3 other small towns in Illinois and Iowa had successfully implemented similar community center projects based directly on the Millbrook model, adapting our collaborative approach to their specific cultural contexts and economic circumstances. The town of Cedar Falls, Iowa, combined our community center concept with their existing agricultural heritage festival, creating a year-round facility that supported local farmers, while providing cultural programming that attracted tourists throughout the growing season. Their success in securing state and federal funding demonstrated how our documentation and advocacy had influenced policymakers to prioritize collaborative rural development initiatives that emphasized community ownership rather than external corporate investment. Riverside, Illinois adapted our tribal partnership model to work with local immigrant communities, creating cultural exchange programs that addressed social tensions while supporting economic development through ethnic food cooperatives and traditional craft marketing. Their modification of our approach proved that the underlying principles of inclusive collaboration could be applied to different types of cultural divisions and community challenges. The National Conference on Rural Development that featured our Carter family as keynote speakers represented recognition that our grassroots approach had influenced academic and policy discussions about effective strategies for addressing rural economic decline. The conference brought together community development professionals, academic researchers, and federal agency officials who were seeking alternatives to traditional top-down approaches that had failed to generate sustainable results in many rural regions. Speaking to an audience of over 800 rural development specialists about our experience required us to articulate lessons learned and best practices that we'd internalized through practical experience, but hadn't necessarily analyzed systematically. The preparation process helped our family understand how transferable our insights were, while also identifying which aspects of our success depended on relationships and circumstances that other communities would need to develop in their own ways. Victoria's recognition with a statewide award for innovative community organizing among young professionals validated the leadership growth that had transformed her from someone overwhelmed by family business responsibilities into a confident advocate for collaborative approaches to rural development. The award citation emphasized her success in bridging cultural and generational divides, while coordinating complex projects that required sustained cooperation among diverse community groups. The statewide recognition led to appointment to the Governor's Rural Development Advisory Committee, where Victoria's experience with grassroots organizing provided perspectives that complemented the academic and professional expertise of other committee members. Her influence on state policy discussions about rural community development demonstrated how local success could translate into broader systemic change. Dan's educational programs had attracted enough attention from state education officials that the Illinois Community College system formally adopted his curriculum model for implementation throughout rural districts that were struggling with limited resources and declining enrollment. The statewide adoption of his approach to combining traditional classroom instruction with community-based experiential learning provided career advancement opportunities that required him to travel throughout the state while maintaining his home base in Millbrook. The consulting and training work that Dan's curriculum adoption generated created professional opportunities that exceeded anything he could have anticipated when we first decided to remain in Millbrook permanently. His expertise in rural education had become recognized at the national level, leading to speaking engagements and consulting contracts that demonstrated how rural communities could incubate innovation rather than simply consuming ideas developed elsewhere. My consulting firm's growth had created opportunities to help establish a rural development fund that supported similar community-centered projects nationally, working with foundations and federal agencies to direct resources toward initiatives that emphasized local ownership and collaborative decision-making. The fund represented institutionalization of principles we'd learned through practical experience, creating sustainable financing mechanisms for communities that wanted to pursue alternatives to corporate-driven development. The Rural Development Fund had approved grants for over 30 community projects throughout the Midwest and South, creating a network of communities that were sharing strategies and supporting each other's efforts to maintain rural viability through collaborative approaches. The network effect amplified individual communities' impact while also providing political influence that could affect federal policy discussions about rural development priorities. The tribal partnership model that had been controversial during our early planning stages became a template for cultural reconciliation efforts in other communities where historical tensions between different cultural groups had hindered collaborative economic development. Academic researchers studying our approach had documented strategies that other communities were adapting to address their specific cultural dynamics and historical relationships. University extension programs throughout the Great Plains and Southwest were using our tribal partnership documentation to help communities develop their own approaches to cultural bridge building that supported economic development while respecting cultural preservation priorities. The replication of our model in different cultural contexts demonstrated how principles of inclusive collaboration could transcend specific historical circumstances. Margaret and Richard's decision to write a guidebook for family businesses transitioning to community-centered missions emerged from the dozens of requests they'd received from rural business owners who wanted practical advice about adapting traditional retail operations to serve broader community development goals. Their guidebook combined business planning strategies with relationship management approaches that reflected lessons learned through their own transformation experience. The guidebook's publication through a regional press specializing in rural development resources provided Margaret and Richard with opportunities to speak at small business conferences and rural development workshops, creating a second career that built on expertise they'd gained through supporting our community center project. Their marriage had not only survived our family's transformation, but had been strengthened through discovering shared purposes that extended beyond immediate business survival. Grandpa Joe's complete recovery had exceeded all medical expectations, and his energy for traveling and speaking about community development and family legacy had inspired audiences throughout the Midwest who were seeking models for successful rural adaptation. His presentations combined personal storytelling with practical advice about building intergenerational cooperation and community collaboration that resonated with audiences facing similar challenges in their own communities. His health restoration seemed directly connected to seeing his vision realized and expanded beyond anything he'd originally imagined, providing evidence that meaningful purpose and community connection could contribute to healing in ways that medical treatment alone couldn't achieve. His speaking engagements had become a ministry of sorts, encouraging other rural communities to believe that positive change was possible through persistent collaborative effort. 5 years later, as I walked through downtown Millbrook, buzzing with activity, I finally understood what Grandpa Joe meant when he said true success is measured by what you leave behind. The understanding I'd gained about the true nature of success became tangible reality on a crisp October morning when Carter Community Center celebrated its 5th anniversary, with festivities that drew over 2,000 visitors to downtown Millbrook, including Governor Patricia Williams, who delivered remarks praising our collaborative model as proof that Illinois rural communities can thrive through innovation and cooperation, rather than simply accepting decline as inevitable. The anniversary celebration showcased achievements that exceeded our most ambitious projections from those early planning sessions, when we'd struggled to imagine whether our community center concept could survive its first year of operation. Millbrook's population had grown by 15% since our opening, reversing decades of demographic decline as young families moved to town specifically to access community amenities and economic opportunities that hadn't existed before. Our collaborative development efforts transformed local possibilities. The new residents represented exactly the demographic trends that rural development specialists hope to encourage, with professional couples choosing small-town life because they could maintain career advancement through remote work while providing their children with community connections and cultural experiences that urban environments couldn't replicate. The community center's programming and the collaborative atmosphere it had fostered made Millbrook attractive to families who might otherwise have dismissed rural living as incompatible with their educational and cultural priorities. Victoria's presence at the anniversary celebration as Millbrook's newly elected mayor, holding her 6-month-old daughter Emma, while delivering welcoming remarks to the assembled crowd, symbolized the intergenerational leadership transition that our community center project had facilitated. Her election the previous spring had been unanimous among the 7 candidates who filed for municipal offices, reflecting widespread recognition of her effectiveness in coordinating collaborative initiatives and representing community interests at county and state levels. Her marriage to David Crow Feather had produced not just personal happiness, but also a living symbol of the cultural bridge building that had transformed Millbrook from a community divided by historical tensions into one that celebrated diversity as a source of strength and innovation. Their daughter Emma was being raised bilingual and bicultural, representing the kind of inclusive identity that would define the next generation's approach to community leadership and cultural preservation. Dan's role directing the Regional Rural Education Cooperative, that now served 5 counties with innovative programming, demonstrated how local success could scale to address broader systemic challenges affecting rural education throughout Illinois. His position required extensive travel and coordination with state education officials, but his home base remained firmly rooted in Millbrook, where he continued developing pilot programs that other rural districts studied and adapted. The educational cooperative that Dan had built from our original community college partnerships now employed 12 full-time staff members and served over 3,000 students annually through programs that combined traditional academic instruction with cultural preservation, environmental stewardship, and entrepreneurship development. His approach to education had influenced state policy discussions about rural school funding and programming in ways that benefited communities far beyond our immediate region. My own life had found balance between the consulting work that took me throughout the Midwest and the daily rhythms of raising 2 children in a community where extended family included not just blood relatives, but also tribal elders who served as surrogate grandparents with wisdom and cultural knowledge that enriched our family's understanding of place and belonging. My daughter Sarah, now 4, and son Michael, 18 months, were growing up with Mary Crow Feather and other tribal elders as regular presences in their lives, creating relationships that transcended the cultural divisions that had once characterized Millbrook's social landscape. The consulting business that had grown from our community center experience now employed 6 people and had helped establish similar collaborative development projects in over 40 rural communities throughout the Midwest and South, creating a network of towns that shared strategies and supported each other's efforts to maintain viability through inclusive economic development approaches. Richard and Margaret's transformation into beloved community grandparents while continuing their roles mentoring other family businesses, considering community-centered transitions, had provided them with purpose and recognition that retirement from traditional retail work alone would never have offered. Their expertise in navigating the emotional and practical challenges of business transformation had become sought after by rural families throughout the region who were struggling with similar decisions about adaptation versus abandonment. Their marriage, which had been strained nearly to the breaking point during our project's most challenging phases, had emerged stronger and more collaborative than ever, built on shared accomplishments and mutual respect that had developed through successfully managing complex community relationships and business transitions. Their grandparent roles with Sarah and Michael, along with Emma and the children of other families who'd become part of our extended community network, provided daily joy that made their sacrifices and struggles meaningful. Grandpa Joe's presence at the anniversary celebration at 83, still sharp and engaged, delighted in watching great-grandchildren play in the community garden, where he'd once worried about business failure and family dissolution. His recovery and continued vitality seemed directly connected to witnessing the realization and expansion of dreams that had sustained him through health crises and family conflicts that could have destroyed less determined visions. The anniversary celebration included families from 12 other towns that had successfully implemented similar community center projects based on adaptations of our Millbrook model, creating a reunion atmosphere that demonstrated how individual community success could generate broader regional transformation. Children from different towns played together while adults shared strategies and celebrated collective achievements that proved rural communities could support each other's development rather than competing for limited resources. Representatives from Cedar Falls, Riverside, and other communities that had adapted our collaborative approach brought displays and presentations about their own innovations and modifications, showing how the basic principles of inclusive development could generate different solutions that reflected each community's specific assets and challenges. As I watched my daughter help Great-Grandpa Joe plant flowers in the community garden, I realized we'd created something that would outlast all of us, not just a building or a business, but a living example of what's possible when families and communities choose cooperation over competition, inclusion over division, and hope over fear. Conclusion. And so ends the remarkable journey of Liz Carter Wilson and her family, a story that proves the most powerful transformations often begin with the smallest acts of courage. From a failing general store on the brink of closure to a thriving community center that has inspired dozens of similar projects across the country, the Carter family's legacy demonstrates that ordinary people can create extraordinary change when they choose collaboration over competition and hope over despair. What started as a desperate attempt to save a family business became something far greater, a blueprint for how rural communities can adapt and thrive in challenging times without sacrificing the values and relationships that make small-town life meaningful. Through their partnership with tribal leaders, their embrace of cultural diversity, and their commitment to inclusive economic development, the Carters showed that the answer to rural decline isn't found in choosing between tradition and progress, but in finding ways to honor the past while building bridges to the future. The ripple effects of their courage continue to spread, touching lives in communities they've never visited, inspiring young people to stay and contribute to their hometowns, and proving that sustainable change happens not through top-down mandates or corporate solutions, but through the patient work of neighbors helping neighbors discover what becomes possible when they work together. Their story reminds us that every community has hidden strengths waiting to be discovered, that every family business has the potential to serve purposes larger than profit, and that every generation has the opportunity to leave something meaningful for those who come after. Most importantly, it shows us that the true measure of success isn't found in individual achievement or financial accumulation, but in the living legacy we create through our willingness to invest in others and build something that will outlast our own lives. If this story of transformation, perseverance, and community building has inspired you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Have you witnessed similar examples of communities coming together to create positive change? What challenges is your own community facing that might be addressed through collaborative approaches like the one the Carter family pioneered? Your insights and experiences could inspire other viewers who are searching for ways to make a difference in their own communities. Please take a moment to subscribe to our channel if you enjoyed this story, as your subscription helps us continue sharing tales of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Ring that notification bell to make sure you never miss our latest uploads, and consider sharing this video with friends or family members who might be inspired by the Carter family's journey from crisis to triumph. Most importantly, remember that every great transformation begins with someone willing to take the first step, even when the outcome is uncertain. Whether you're facing challenges in your family business, your community, or your personal life, the Carter family's story proves that with courage, collaboration, and persistence, it's possible to transform even the most difficult circumstances into opportunities for growth and positive change. The question isn't whether change is possible, but whether you're ready to be part of creating it.